sort of get us started before we get into the presentations and the discussion. So, earlier this summer, I visited Athens and made a pilgrimage to Aristotle's Lyceum. I was struck by the idea that perhaps what I am doing in Platypus is essentially the same as what Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were doing back in ancient Greece. Spencer and I were recently discussing the recurrent trope of Aristotle and Marx, apropos of today's discussion of Marxism and philosophy, and he recalled his feeling nauseous when reading Castoriadis' famous essay on Aristotle and Marx, published in the same issue of the journal Social Research, alongside Moishe Postone's seminal essay, Necessity, Labor, and Time. So you go from Castoriadis, Aristotle and Marx, to Postone, Necessity, Labor, and Time. Spencer said that he had felt sick at the thought that nothing had changed since Aristotle's time. I recalled, in my conversation with Spencer, how Frantz Fanon wrote in Black Skin, White Masks that he would be happy to learn that an African philosopher had corresponded with Plato, but this wouldn't make a difference for 8-year-olds in Haiti and the Dominican Republic forced to cut sugar canes for a living. This compares well to the former Black Panther, Assata Shakur, who, writing from her exile in Cuba on Black Lives Matter, referred to Black Americans as Africans lost in America. But are blacks any less lost in Africa today? Am I, an Italian or Irish, lost in America too? I often feel that way, that my peasant ancestors were dragged into bourgeois society to ill effect, to my present misery. What would it mean not to be lost? Was I returning home, in a sense, when as an intellectual I returned to Aristotle's school in Athens? Was I any less lost in Athens? Adorno wrote in his inaugural lecture on the idea of natural history that I submit myself, so to speak, to the materialist dialectic. What he meant, of course, was that he could only speak misleadingly of submitting himself to the materialist dialectic, as if he would not already be dominated by it, whether he was conscious of his submission or not. This reminds us of Trotsky's statement to his recalcitrant followers who rejected Hegelianism that, quote, you may not be interested in the dialectic, but the dialectic is interested in you. Why should we be interested in philosophy then? Adorno did not mean that he was submitting himself to Marxism as the materialist dialectic in the sense of submitting to Marxist thought. No, he meant, as we must mean in Platypus, that he accepted the challenge of Marxist thought as thinking which registered a greater reality, as a challenge and a call to task for Adorno's own thinking. Foucault wrote about his chagrin that just when one thinks one has overcome Hegel, Hegel is still there smiling back at you. This rather paranoid claim by Foucault as a mental phenomenon has a real meaning, however, which is that Hegel still speaks in some unavoidable way to our real condition. What is meant by Hegel here, of course, is the entirety of the alleged master narrative of the Western philosophical tradition culminating in bourgeois modernity. Engaging philosophy, then, is not being told how to think, but rather allowing one's thinking to be challenged and tasked in a particular way. It is a microcosm of how society challenges and tasks our thinking, whether we are inclined to it or not. Historical philosophers are not some dead white males, the authority of whose thinking threatens to dominate our own. We do not, or at least ought not, to read philosophy in order to be told how to think. No. The philosophy that comes down to us from history is not the dead weight of the past, but is part of that past. And the past is not dead, or even really past, since past actions still act upon us in the present, whether we like it or not. Marx reminds us that man makes history, but not according to conditions of his own choosing. We cannot avoid the past, but we are concerned with the symptomatic attempts to free ourselves from the past by trying to avoid it, especially on the left, and especially by ostensible Marxists. As Korsch reminds us, among other ways, this can take the form of trying to avoid the philosophical aspects of Marxism. We might recall that Korsch's essay on Marxism and philosophy, the background reading for today, was the very first text we read in the Platypus reading group. This was done before it was called Platypus, of course, but it was still our first collective discussion of a reading as a group. Our reading was predicated on opening up, not philosophy, but rather the political foundations for Adorno's thinking. It was meant to help lead my academic students of Adorno, not from Marxism to philosophy, but from philosophy to Marxism. This is the intention of today's event as well. We come full circle. Perhaps indeed nothing has changed, whether from Aristotle's time or from 12 years ago with Platypus. So, part of our internal discussion, both on the list, on the members list, and more privately among Richard, Jensen, Teo, Reid, and myself, because we've been carrying on a little five-way thread for the last month or so, centers around some peculiar formulations that we're familiar with from Lukacs. So we have Korsch in the background, but we also have Lukacs in the background. Namely, the relationship between Marx and Hegel as a matter of method versus system. This is the way people usually talk about it. That Marx accepted Hegel's method but rejected his system, which of course would not have made sense to Hegel, nor would it make sense to people like Robert Pippin or Gillian Rose. In other words, they would have said that such an idea of accepting Hegel's method and not Hegel's system betrays a misunderstanding of Hegel. Right? You can't accept the method and not the system. So let's see what Lukacs has to say about that. That's what I handed out to you guys. He says, this is in the original preface from 1922 to History and Class Consciousness. It's towards the end. It says, Hegel's position today is the reverse of Marx's own. Hegel's position today is the reverse of Marx's own. The problem with Marx is precisely to take his method and his system as we find them, and to demonstrate that they form a coherent unity that must be preserved. The method and the system of Marx has to be preserved in its unity. The opposite, Lukacs says, is true of Hegel. The task Hegel imposes is to separate out from the complex web of ideas, with its sometimes glaring contradictions, all the seminal elements of his thought, and rescue them as a vital intellectual force for the present. He is a more profitable and potent thinker than many people imagine, and as I see it, the more vigorously we set about the task of confronting this issue, the more clearly we will discern his fecundity and his power as a thinker. But for this, we must add, and it is a scandal that we should have to add, that a greater knowledge of Hegel's writings is utterly indispensable. Of course, we will no longer expect to discover his achievement in his total system. The system, as we have it, belongs to the past. Notice, the system, as we have it today, belongs to the past. So he's always articulating history into the next year. Even this statement concedes too much, for in my view, a really incisive critic would have to conclude that he had to deal not with an authentically organic and coherent system, but with a number of overlapping systems. The contradictions in method between the phenomenology of spirit and the system itself are but one instance of this. Hegel must not be treated as a dead dog, but even so, we must demolish the dead architecture of the system in its historical form and release the extremely relevant and modern sides of his thought and help them once again to become a vital and effective force in the present. So the architecture of the system is dead. It is dead. And we have to demolish it to free the vital force. Right? Pay attention to his metaphor. And then he says, I should perhaps point out to the reader unfamiliar with dialectics one difficulty inherent in the nature of dialectical method relating to the definition of concepts and terminology. It is of the essence of the dialectical method that concepts which are false in their abstract one-sidedness are later transcended or sublated, negated, realized. The process of transcendence makes it inevitable that we should operate with these one-sided abstract and false concepts. The process of transcendence makes it inevitable that we should deal with these one-sided false concepts. These concepts acquire their true meaning less by definition than by their function as aspects that are then transcended in the totality. Moreover, it is even more difficult to establish fixed meanings for concepts in Marx's improved version of the dialectic than in the Hegelian original. Marx's concepts are even more difficult to establish in their meaning than Hegel's are. For if concepts are only the intellectual forms of historical realities, then these forms, one-sided, abstract, and false as they are, belong to the true unity as genuine aspects of it. Hegel's statements about this problem of terminology in the preface of the Phenomenology are thus even more true than Hegel himself realized, meaning maybe more true today than for Hegel in his own time, when he said that just as the expressions unity of subject and object, of finite and infinite, of being and thought, etc., have the drawback that object and subject bear the same meaning as when they exist outside that totality, so that within the unity they mean something other than is implied by their expression, so too falsehood is not, as false, any longer a moment of truth. In the pure historicization of the dialectic, that's one of the things that we focus on in Platypus, the pure historicization of the dialectic, namely Marx, this statement receives yet another twist. Right? So the Hegelian dialectic, in being purely historicized, receives another twist. Insofar as the false is an aspect of the true, it is both false and non-false. When the professional demolishers of Marx criticized his lack of conceptual rigor and his use of image rather than definitions, they cut as sorry a figure as did Schopenhauer when he tried to expose Hegel's alleged logical howlers in his Hegel critique. All that is proved is their total inability to grasp even the ABC of the dialectical method. The logical conclusion for the dialectician to draw from this failure is not that he is faced with a conflict between different scientific methods, but that he is in the presence of a social phenomenon, and that by conceiving it as a socio-historical phenomenon, he can at once refute it and transcend it dialectically. Poor Lukacs and Korsch. I think they would be a little horrified that in 2018, we're still cracking our heads on them. Marx would certainly be horrified. So would Hegel. All right. Bear with me. All right, so this is the article that we published that hopefully you guys had some opportunity to read ahead of this, but it might help to be intoned and not just be read.
Intonation is very important.
Intonation is very important. So let's start with the ends of philosophy, namely misery. Marxism considered philosophy as bourgeois ideology. This meant first and foremost radical bourgeois philosophy, the modern philosophy of bourgeois emancipation, the thought of the revolt of the third estate, to use some of Korsch's language. But pre-bourgeois philosophy, traditional philosophy, was also addressed as bourgeois ideology. But ideology is a modern phenomenon. There's little point in calling either Aristotle or Augustine ideology. It is when philosophy is invoked in bourgeois society that it becomes ideological, religion too. So what is meant by philosophy as ideology? This goes to the issue of Marxist ideology critique. What did Marxism mean by ideology as false consciousness? False in what way? For if bourgeois ideology were considered the ideology of the sociological group of the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, then there would be nothing false about it. It would be the consciousness adequate to the social being of the ruling class. It would be the true consciousness of the bourgeoisie. So it must be false not for the bourgeoisie, but rather for others, for the proletariat. This kind of class analysis of ideology would be concerned that the workers not fall for the ideology of the ruling class. It would be a warning against the workers adopting the idealism of the bourgeoisie that would blind them to their real social condition in capitalism. The idea here is that somehow the workers would remain ignorant of their exploitation by the capitalists if they remained mired in bourgeois ideology. Of course, Marxism was originally no such material analysis or debunking of wrong thinking. No. Rather, the original Marxist ideology critique, Marx and Engels' ideology critique of bourgeois society, was the imminent dialectical critique of the way society and capitalism necessarily appears to its members, bourgeois and proletarian, capitalists and workers alike. It was the critique of the true consciousness of the workers, as well as of the capitalists. Now that formulation, as you know from many years in Platypus, just lost me 99% of ostensible Marxists, as well as all of the rest of the left, whether socialist or liberal, who do indeed think that the poor benighted workers and other subaltern need us intellectuals to tell them what their true social interests are. That is not what Marxism, Marx and Engels, originally thought, however. Marxism began with the critique of socialism, specifically with the critique of the most prominent socialist thinker of Marx and Engels' formative moment in the 1840s, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Proudhon, who coined the term anarchism, claimed that he respected only three authorities, intellectually: Adam Smith, Hegel, and the Bible. Marxism is usually thought of as the synthesis of German idealist philosophy, British political economy, and French socialist politics. But what Marxism actually was the imminent dialectical critique of these three phenomena, which Marx and Engels considered three different forms of appearance of the same thing, namely the most advanced bourgeois ideology of their time. So French socialism, advanced bourgeois ideology of the early to mid-19th century. They were all true expressions of their historical moment, of the Industrial Revolution, but as such, they were also all false. Proudhon wrote of the philosophy of misery, attacking the heirs of Adam Smith in utilitarianism, James Mill and Jeremy Bentham, among others, and other contemporary British political economists such as Malthus and David Ricardo and their French counterparts. Marx wrote his first major work on political economy and the class struggle in industrial capitalism as a critique of Proudhon, cleverly inverting its title, namely The Poverty of Philosophy, or The Misery of Philosophy. This is the philosophy of misère, different kind of word than we have in English. I was deeply impressed by this work, and especially by its title, when I first read it as an aspiring young Marxist in college. It signified to me a basic truth, which is that the problem of capitalism and its potential overcoming in socialism was not a matter of philosophy, not a problem of thinking. Reading further, in Marx's 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts, I read and deeply internalized Marx's injunction that communism is a dogmatic abstraction, which was one-sided, expressing the same thing as its opposite, private property, and, like bourgeois society itself, was internally divided, for instance, between collectivism and individualism, and so could not be considered a vision of an emancipated future society, but only a negation of the present. I had read in Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto their critique of reactionary socialism, namely socialism that wants to go back to pre-capitalism, and their observation that everything of which communism stood accused was actually the specter of what capitalism itself was already doing, abolishing private property, among other things. This all told me that, for Marx and Engels at least, the problem of bourgeois ideology was not a matter that could be expressed, let alone rectified by proper methodology, by a kind of right thinking opposed to it. In short, I recognized early on that Marxism was not some better philosophy. Marxism was not a philosophical critique of philosophy, but rather something else entirely. For instance, Marx and Engels' critique of the young Hegelians was not as philosophers, but in their philosophical claims for politics. This was also true of Lenin's critique of the Machians among the Bolsheviks in Materialism and Imperial Criticism from 1908. The critique was of the relation between philosophy and politics. It was thus also not a political critique of philosophy, So I've titled my talk here Ends of Philosophy after the title for the week in our Platypus primary reading group syllabus, where we read Karl Korsch's 1923 essay on Marxism and Philosophy, the recommended background reading for today's discussion. In the syllabus week title, as well as here, I intend to play on the multiple meaning of the word ends. What are the ends of philosophy according to Marxism in terms of its telos, its goals, its purposes, and its satisfaction? What would it take to to attain and thus overcome the aspirations of philosophy? Specifically, what would it take to satisfy bourgeois, that is to say, modern philosophy? What would make philosophy superfluous? This is posed in the same way that Marxism sought to make labor as social value superfluous. How does labor seek to abolish itself in capitalism? The same can be said of philosophy. Capitalism seeks to abolish philosophy too. It seeks to abolish labor, seeks to abolish philosophy. What would it take to bring philosophy to an end, to its own end? Not by denying the need for philosophy, but by satisfying it. But there have been other moments, before and after Marxism, which sought to overcome philosophy through its satisfaction, through satisfying the need for philosophy. The need for, the necessity of philosophy in the modern world is different from its need previously, fundamentally different. The need to account for freedom in bourgeois emancipation was new and different. This did not motivate and inform traditional philosophy, but it fundamentally tasked modern philosophy, at least the philosophy that mattered most to Marxism, the Enlightenment and German idealism at its culmination. But the need for philosophy in capitalism is also different from its need in the bourgeois revolution. Please allow me to address several different historical moments at the end of philosophy. I use this concept of moments at the end of philosophy instead of alternative approaches, such as varieties of anti-philosophy, because I think that trying to address Marxism as an anti-philosophy is misleading. It is also misleading in addressing other such supposed anti-philosophies, such as those of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, existentialism, Heidegger, etc., as well as other traditions entirely, such as the Enlightenment philosophes contra philosophy, or empiricism and analytic philosophy contra metaphysics. For instance, Heidegger sought the potential end to thousands of years of Western metaphysics going all the way back to Plato. Yet all these various phenomena express, to my mind, a common issue, namely the problem of philosophy per se in the modern era, both in the era of bourgeois emancipation and subsequently in capitalism. What is philosophy such that it can experience an end? It is not merely its etymological meaning, the love of knowledge or wisdom or the love of thinking.
The intro to Marx, it's hard to hear.
It's okay. Philosophers are not merely smart or sage. They're not merely sophists, clever thinkers. Philosophy cannot be considered merely the mastery of logic or of semantics. If that were true, then most lawyers would be better philosophers than most avowed philosophers. And if you know anything about the sophists, right, they were lawyers. That's what they did for a living. What is philosophy? Excuse me. The ends of philosophy cannot be considered an end to sophistry, finally putting the clever fellows down. It cannot be considered an analog to Shakespeare's "First we kill all the lawyers." It is not meant to be the triumph of Philistinism, although you might think so from a lot of Marxist deprecation of philosophy, especially as bourgeois ideology. Such Marxists want to put a stop to all mystification by putting a stop to the mystifiers of bourgeois society, the lackeys, the paid liars of the capitalist bourgeoisie. They want to stop the philosophers from pulling the wool down over the eyes of the exploited and oppressed. This is not my meaning. This was not even Socrates, or Plato's version, meaning in taking down the sophists. Philosophy cannot be considered either negatively or positively as the arrogation of all thinking. It is not some queen of the sciences that is meant to make proper sense of and superintend any and all human thought in every domain. It is not the king of reason, not the thought police. Marxism did not seek to replace philosophy in such a role, no. Yet this seems to be precisely what everyone wants from philosophy, or from anti-philosophy. They want their thinking dictated to them. Korsch addresses this as Bonapartism in philosophy. We seem to want to be told how and what to think by philosophers or by anti-philosophers. It is an authoritarian impulse, but one that is an authentic expression of our time, nonetheless. Capitalism brings forth its own philosopher kings. But this is not at all what the immediate predecessors for Marxists thought in philosophy, Kant and Hegel, considered as their task. Kant in beginning philosophy anew, and Hegel in completing this, did not seek to replace the thinking of others. No, precisely the opposite. They sought to free philosophy to make it worldly. I think that Reid once quoted Kant as saying that after he read Rousseau, he felt that he didn't have the right to think of himself as any more intelligent than a day laborer. They thought that they could do so precisely because they found that the world had already become philosophical. After them, they thought there would no longer be a need to further develop philosophy as such, capital P, but only the need for philosophical reflection in the various different diverse domains of human activity. Our modern academic institutions reflect this. One receives a PhD, the Doctor of Philosophy, in chemistry, meaning one is qualified to doctor, to minister and correct, to treat the methods and the attendant thinking, the philosophy of the science of chemistry, without, however, necessarily becoming an expert specialist philosopher of science, or studying the specialized discipline, philosophy of science per se. And so I should say that having gotten a PhD, it's a most humiliating experience, namely to think that the highest objectifiable achievement of one's life is to have earned some degree. And I was telling Richard about this, I was watching Terms of Endearment, a wonderful movie from the early 80s, in which Shirley MacLaine's character tells her daughter, your husband thinks that getting tenure is a life goal. Let that sink in. According to Lukacs, such specialized knowledge is found in academia, as well as in the various technical vocations, such as law, journalism, or art, exhibited reification in capitalism, a disintegrated particularization of atomized consciousness, in which losing the forest for the trees was the very predicate of experience and knowledge. But this was the opposite of what Kant and Hegel had expected. They expected not disintegration, but the organic, living, and changing relations of diverse multiplicity. Marx found a very different world from Kant and Hegel's after the Industrial Revolution. It was not a philosophical world in capitalism, not an enlightened realm of sober senses to which bourgeois philosophy had aspired, but something much darker. It was a phantasmagoria of commodity fetishism, full of beguiling metaphysical subtleties, for which one needed to refer to the mist-enveloped regions of religion for proper models. In capitalism, bourgeois society was sunk in a kind of animism, a world of objects exhibiting theological niceties. There was a need for a new enlightenment, a second enlightenment specific to the needs of the 19th century, that is specific to the new needs of industrial capitalism, for which the prior thinking of bourgeois emancipation, even at its best, for instance by Rousseau, Smith, Kant, and Hegel, was not equipped to adequately address. It needed a new recognition of the relation between social being and consciousness. But for Marx and Engels, this new task of enlightenment was something that could not be accomplished philosophically, could not be brought to fruition in thinking, but only in actual political struggle and the transformation of society. This was because, unlike the emancipation of bourgeois society, which took several centuries and came to consciousness of itself as such only late, no longer cloaking itself in the religious garb of Christianity, the Protestant Reformation is some return to the Christianity of the original apostles, freed from the corruptions of the church, and arrived at self-consciousness only at the end of its process of transformation in the 18th century. As Hegel put it, the owl of Minerva, that is knowledge, flies at dusk. Proper consciousness comes only post festum, after the fact of change. But Marx and Engels found the task of socialism and capitalism to be motivated by a new need. The proletarianization of the bourgeois social relations of labor, the society of cooperative production in crisis with the Industrial Revolution, required a new consciousness of contradiction, a dialectical and historical materialism to properly recognize its tasks. As Marx put it, the social revolution of the 19th century, in contradistinction to the bourgeois revolution, could not take its poetry from the past, but needed to take its poetry from the future. This was quite a paradoxical formulation, especially since Marx and Engels explicitly abjured utopian socialism, finding it a realm of images of capitalism, not a world beyond it. This was because they found the workers' struggles against the capitalists to be motivated by bourgeois consciousness, the consciousness of the bourgeois revolution. Socialism was born in the Jacobinism of the French Revolution, for instance, in the former Jacobin Babeuf's conspiracy of equals, still motivated by the aspirations of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Proudhon, for example, was motivated in his anarchist socialism avowedly by Adam Smith and Hegel, and the Bible, animated unabashedly by bourgeois political economy and philosophy. Marx and Engels didn't think that this was wrong, but only inadequate. They didn't offer an alternative to Proudhon, to Smith and Hegel, or the Bible, but only a critique of how bourgeois thought mystified the crisis and task of capitalism. The world necessarily appeared in bourgeois terms. There were no other terms. There was no other form of consciousness. There was no other philosophy. Nor was there a need for a new philosophy. Bourgeois philosophy for Marx and Engels had successfully summed up and appropriated all prior philosophical enlightenment. They agreed with Kant and Hegel. Bourgeois social thought had successfully summed up and completed all prior thinking about society. Marx and Engels neither disputed nor sought to replace it. They were concerned only with its self-contradiction in capitalism. Not its hypocrisy, but its authentic antinomies, which both drove it on and left it stuck. The bourgeois end of history turned out to be the opposite of what it intended. Not a final stage of freedom, but rather a final stage of unfreedom, the crossroads of socialism or barbarism. This affected the status of philosophy. Bourgeois philosophy no longer described freedom, but rather unfreedom. Or, more dialectically, it described both. The reproduction of unfreedom in the struggle for freedom. As a result, the task of freedom was no longer expressed by the need for all human activity to achieve an adequate, Hegelian, philosophically reflective self-consciousness, but rather to realize in practice, and thus recognize in consciousness, the limits of such self-consciousness, of such philosophical reflection. There was a crisis in radical bourgeois philosophy. The crisis and decay of Hegelianism was an authentic historical phenomenon, not a mistake. Like liberal democracy, philosophy in capitalism was no longer itself, and was no longer tasked with becoming itself, attaining its aspirations, but rather was tasked with overcoming itself, superseding its achievements. The achievements of bourgeois emancipation seemed ruined in the 19th century. Indeed, capitalism already accomplished such self-overcoming of bourgeois society, but perversely, negating itself without satisfying itself. In so doing, it constantly reposed the task of achieving itself as an impossible necessity. Bourgeois philosophy became the opposite of what it was, namely utopian. Not worldly philosophy, but an ideal, a mere notion, mocked by the real, ugly, and anything but philosophical world. Because of this, precisely because of this, bourgeois philosophy did not end, but constantly reinvented itself. However, on an increasingly impoverished basis. It radically revolutionized itself, but also in so doing, radically undermined itself. And of course, that's what Adorno thinks of Heidegger and analytic philosophy. Philosophy remained necessary, but proved impossible. It disintegrated into epistemology, ontology, and ethics. They went their separate ways. But they also drove themselves into blind alleys, dead ends. This actually indicates the task of philosophy to overcome itself, however in perverted form. So what is philosophy? One straightforward way of answering this is simply metaphysics. Kant, following Rousseau, had overcome the division and opposition between rationalism and empiricism by finding a new foundation for metaphysics. This was the Kantian Copernican turn and revolution in philosophy. But it was not simply a new metaphysics, but rather a new account of metaphysics, of philosophy itself. Moreover, it was revolutionary in an additional sense. It was not only a revolution, but also accounted for itself as revolutionary. This is because it was a metaphysics of change, and not merely change, but radical qualitative transformation. It was a revolutionary account of the fundamental transformability of the substance of philosophy itself. In short, it was a philosophy of freedom. It was the self-reflection of practical freedom in society, that society made human life's transcendence of nature possible at all, but in so doing created new problems to be worked through and overcome. It is precisely this metaphysics of freedom, however, that has gone into crisis and disintegrated in capitalism. This has been the expression of the crisis and disintegration, the decay of bourgeois society. The goal of philosophy in overcoming itself is to free thinking from an overarching and underlying metaphysics at all. Kant and Hegel thought that they had done so already, but capitalism, in its crisis of the metaphysics of bourgeois society, revealed that there was indeed an underlying overarching metaphysics still to be overcome, that of social practice or society itself. The self-production and self-overcoming of the subject in its socially and practically objective activity, labor, needed to be overcome. The end of philosophy, the end of a singular metaphysics, or of metaphysics per se, aims at the freeing of both action and thinking from any unitary framework. It is the freeing of an ever-expanding and limitless, without end, diverse multiplicity of new and different forms of acting, being, and knowing. Postmodernism was, as Moise Pistone put it, premature post-capitalism. It aimed at the freeing of the small s subjects from the big S subject. It also aimed at freedom from capital H history. It meant overcoming Hegel's philosophy of history. We already live in such freedom in bourgeois society, however, perverted by capitalism. Diverse activities already inhabit different realms of being and call forth different kinds of ethical judgments. Different activities, different forms of being, different ethical judgments. Doctors and lawyers practice activities that define being, that define the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in different ways. They really do. And are hence ethically bound in different ways. Doctors discipline themselves ethically differently from scientists. Among scientists, biology has a different epistemology from physics. There are different methods because there are different objects. There is no philosophy in the sense of a metaphysical logic that encompasses them all. Lawyers, for example, themselves practice differential ethics. Prosecutors and defense attorneys in criminal law are bound by different rules of behavior. The practice of civil law is ethically distinct from criminal law. The rules of evidence are different. The rules of truth are different. Really different, consequentially different. We do not seek to bind society to one form of knowledge, one code of conduct, one way of life. There is no philosophy that could or should encompass them all. It would be arrogant to claim that there is one singular logic that can be mastered by anyone for governing everything. Bourgeois society has already established well the reasonable limits to philosophy and its competence. In ancient civilization, there were differentiated realms of being, knowing, and acting. There was a caste system in which there were different laws for peasants, for merchants, for artisans, and for different kinds of artisans, for different arts and different sciences, and for the nobility and for the clergy. But they were unified in a divine order of the great chain of being. There was heterogeneity, but all with a single origin in God, all of God's creatures in all of God's creation. That mystery was to remain unknown to man and known only to God. There was a reason for everything, but only God could know it. There was not philosophy, but theology. And theology was not to arrogate to itself the place of the mind of God, but only ponder man's place in and relationship to it. Theology established the limits to man's knowledge of God. We knew only what God revealed to us through his covenant. We all heard the word of God, but God told his different creatures different things. In overcoming theology, philosophy did not seek to replace it. It sought to explore the mind of man, not to relate to and limit itself with respect to the mind of God. It was not concerned with divine or natural limits, but with freedom. There is no possible one single and once and for all account of freedom, for then freedom would not be free. There is no possible account of being free, but only of becoming free. And there is only one such account, that of bourgeois emancipation from traditional civilization. It was to set free all the diverse and multiple activities of mankind in relation to other humans, to nature, and to ourselves. Marx was both a Hegelian and departed from Hegel, with a historical and not a philosophical difference. As Marx put it, for Hegel himself, the Hegelian system was not ready-made and finished as it was for those who came after. As Marx observed, Hegelianism went into crisis for real historical reasons, not due to misunderstanding by his followers, but rather the crisis came from Hegelian philosophy's actual contact with the world, and that world had become as internally contradictory in capitalism as Hegelianism became in contact with it. The Hegelian dialectic is both appropriate and inappropriate to the problem of capitalism. The crisis and disintegration of Hegelianism was a crisis of metaphysics, of philosophy, at a higher and deeper, and not a lower or more superficial level from Hegelianism. Hegelianism was falsified not in itself, but by history. But Hegelianism was also borne out by history as the last word in philosophy, the last word in metaphysics. Marxism cannot be purged of its Hegelianism without becoming incoherent. Marxism remains Hegelian, albeit with what Lukacs called an additional twist of the pure historicization of the dialectic. If society in capitalism remains bourgeois in its ideals, with the goal of providing opportunities for social labor, materially it has become its opposite. As a capitalist, it prioritizes not labor but capital, and at the expense of labor. This means society is tasked with the material challenge of overcoming its ideals. But as Marx recognized, this can only be done on the basis of society's own ideals, in and through their self-contradiction. In philosophy, this means the task expressed by the self-contradiction of Hegelianism. Capitalism is the model of the Marxist Hegelian procedure of immanent dialectical critique. This is how capitalism itself moves, how it reproduces itself through self-contradiction. Capitalism is its own practical critique, reproducing itself by constantly overcoming itself. As Marx put it, the only limit to capital is capital itself. But capital is the transgression of any and all limits. It is the way capitalism overcomes itself. Its dynamic process of change, which is its own freedom, its self-limitation. The Marxian horizon of freedom beyond capitalism is freedom beyond the Hegelian dialectic, beyond the bourgeois dialectic of transformation, beyond labor as a process of self-overcoming through production. There thus remains a unitary metaphysics binding all social practices, dominating, constraining, and distorting their further development in freedom under capitalism, the bourgeois right of labor. The form of total freedom in bourgeois emancipation, self-production in society, has become in capitalism the form of total unfreedom. The social condition for labor has become that of the self-destruction of labor and capital. The goal of labor and capital is to abolish itself, but it can do so only by realizing itself as self-contradiction. Hegel's negative labor of the concept must be completed. Short of that, it dominates us. Overcoming this will mean overcoming metaphysics, overcoming philosophy. At least overcoming philosophy in any way known or knowable hitherto.
Before we proceed, I want to show you your experience. Reid, Jensen, did you hear that? Yes. Okay, so you're hearing things. Okay?
Go for it.
Wait, do you want to go, Jensen, or not?
Richard.
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 Okay, so as Chris and a few other people in this room know, even though I had a Should I speak louder?
Go ahead, just making sure.
Okay. So I totally did nothing until really the very last minute. Like today. I was typing this up on my cell phone, and then I printed it up, but I made the type font big on the cell phone, and I forgot to shrink it when I printed it up. That's I have this huge type. Okay, so probably if I had more time, I could get a bit more concise, but anyway, I'll try not to be too long. Marxism and philosophy. The topic of this discussion is Marxism and philosophy. And by linking these two nouns, the problem appears to be to establish the correct relationship between them. But is it also not necessary to establish the meaning of the two terms? This is not a simple thing to do. If it were clear what Marxism is, then Platypus would not need to exist at all. But as you all know, the question of what Marxism is has for a long time been extremely obscure. But in attempting only to focus on Marxism, one runs the risk of underestimating the even deeper obscurity that shrouds the other term, philosophy. One way you might be tempted to understand this discussion is to think of us as three cooks preparing an intellectual soup. One cook, Jensen, says, there's not enough Hegel in the soup. Another cook, Richard, says, there's already too much Hegel in the soup. Finally, the third cook, Chris, says, no, I'm a master chef. Trust me, there's exactly the right amount of Hegel. Then he turns to Jensen and says, stop trying to put too much Hegel in the soup. It will drown out all the other flavors. Then he turns to Richard and says, Richard, I know you have an allergy to Hegel, but Hegel is the basic ingredient. Then there's a disagreement about another ingredient. Jensen wants to put some Heidegger in the soup. Not too much, mind you, just a bit, because the flavor is interesting. This time, however, the other two cooks agree. They do not want any Heidegger. They say, there's something at once sour and rancid in Heidegger, and it has a smell that reminds us of rotting corpses. But this way of understanding the issue would, I think, be wrong. How then would I formulate what I think that this conversation is about? I would say Jensen and Chris disagree about how Marxism is philosophical. Chris and Richard disagree about how philosophy can be Marxist. Another way of putting this might be that Jensen and Chris disagree more about Marxism than Chris and Richard do. But Chris and Richard disagree more about philosophy. I will say something that may shock you. I do not think that an adequate Marxist philosophy is necessary for Marxist politics. The notion that correct philosophical thinking is important to struggling successfully for socialism strikes me as magical thinking. Korsch and Lukacs both wrote subtle and intelligent books on Marxism and philosophy, but Lukacs ended up as a Stalinist and Korsch an anti-Leninist. Lenin and Engels wrote some books on philosophy for which I have no respect, although they are, of course, Marxist classics. But Lenin and Engels were incomparably better as political thinkers. The Sparks once warned me when I expressed hostility to materialism and criticism to remember where those people ended up, quote unquote. The answer is that Lunacharsky ended up as Commissar of Education and then was ambassador to the Spanish Republic before he died in an accident. Bogdanov was one of the founders of Prolet Cult, taught economics at Moscow University, and died in a bizarre blood transfusion experiment.
That he inflicted upon himself. So these leading Marxists did not end up in the camp of counter-revolution, whereas Plekhanov and the Mensheviks, who shared Lenin's philosophical orthodoxy, and Lenin encourages Marxists to read Plekhanov, denounced the Bolshevik Revolution. The revolution, I am sure, will neither succeed nor fail because of understanding or not understanding dialectics. That, I think, is actually a good thing, because if the revolution needed philosophy, the project of revolution would seem even more hopeless than it does at present. Furthermore, the wonderful phrases about making the world philosophical or overcoming philosophy have an ironic ring to them nowadays. We're not living in the 19th century or even the early 20th. Does the bourgeoisie of the 21st century even need philosophy?
If a Pippin can refer to philosophy as stealing ideas from dead people, we might ask if philosophy even exists anymore. Perhaps philosophy is dead, as well as the left. Is the academic discipline that persists under that name in universities even what it was in the early or mid-20th century? Or is it just a form of cultural history? Who today plays the role of a Heidegger or a Sartre or a Wittgenstein or a Russell? When I was in Malaysia, I was told that there were no universities with departments of philosophy in the entire country. Even if I was misinformed, the fact that the idea is so plausible says much about what philosophy is today. Philosophy as an academic field continues to enjoy a diminishing cultural prestige and continues to generate scholarship. But another way of saying this is that it's begun to seem like studying a dead language. There are philosophers now, perhaps in roughly the same sense that there are Assyriologists. Why then concern oneself with the question of Marxism and philosophy? One answer is because Marxism has failed. Another is because philosophy has failed. So what is philosophy? This simple question was posed to me naively once by a friend. I found it so disturbing in its naivete and so difficult to answer that I have never forgotten it. In general, the question, what is X, where X is some discipline, does not take one into that discipline. The question, what is chemistry, is not a question that belongs to chemistry, for example. But the question of what philosophy is seems indeed to be precisely that, a philosophical question. Perhaps I should mention at this point, however, the context in which the question was asked. It was asked of me by my friend Ernie Osterreicher immediately after we had visited the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he had been a prisoner 6 decades earlier, and where both his parents and younger sister had died in the gas chambers. The abstractness of the question, thus by association, summons up for me an image of the haunting beauty of dark, decaying barracks covered by softly falling snow on a cold Polish January day. Is the context of this anecdote relevant? Emil Fackenheim, a noted German Jewish thinker, could write, Hegel's actuality of the rational leaves room only for world historically insignificant evils to be disposed of as relapses into tribalism or barbarism. In their post-Enlightenment optimism, all but a few modern philosophers have ignored or denied the demonic. Hegel's philosophy is the most radical and hence the most serious expression of this modern tendency. Any inquiry into the truth of Hegel's philosophy must confront its claims with the gas chambers of Auschwitz. Is it barbaric then, as Fackenheim implies, to be a Hegelian after Auschwitz? The answer to this question does not concern me now. Rather, I wish to examine the grounds on which such a question can be asked. I want to ask, how can such a question be philosophical? One might for Auschwitz substitute Hiroshima, or the French Revolution, or the Industrial Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, or the rise of bourgeois society. The assumption behind all such questions is that the truth of philosophy is connected to the history of human society. Yet this way of seeing philosophy is quite recent in the history of philosophy, and would have seemed absurd to some of the greatest philosophers. To the ancients, philosophy and history would have seemed opposites. I shall now propose a different sort of philosophical question that is again not considered for its own sake, but rather for the light it sheds on what philosophy is. Chapter 52 of Bertrand Russell's Principles of Mathematics, which I happen to have at hand, is entitled Kant's Theory of Space, and in it, Russell immediately makes it clear that the whole chapter is a critique of Kant's views, saying that they are, quote, on almost every point of mathematical theory, diametrically opposed, unquote, to his own view. Now, the issues raised by this controversy between Russell and Kant are philosophical ones. They are clearly not mathematical questions despite their subject matter. Both Russell and Kant are generally considered philosophers, and both of them, despite their differences, would have agreed that these questions are indeed philosophical in nature. But here, philosophy seems to be something quite different from the question earlier raised of the dialectic and the gas chambers. It is no longer an inquiry into the fate of humanity, but an abstract inquiry into the nature of reason. To Fackenheim, one might answer that he might be right if there is no socialist revolution, but that the achievement of socialism would justify Hegel even in the face of the gas chamber. Whether or not one agrees with this answer, it at least makes sense. But it's hard to imagine a comparable response to the questions that divide Kant and Russell. Philosophy here seems to speak in what classical grammarians would call the gnomic aspect. In describing Kant, Adorno writes, quote, quoting Adorno, "On this point, we have to say that the concept of truth in Kant, and this is profoundly bound up in bourgeois thought, is itself that of a timeless truth. To be absolute for Kant means as much as to be irrefutable by the passage of time, an absolutely secure possession, something that cannot be taken from you, that you can keep safe in your own hands forever. The concept of a timeless truth, that is one of the innermost driving forces of Kantian philosophy." He also observes, on the one hand, he, Kant, perceives, like no one else before him, that time is a necessary condition of knowledge, and hence of every allegedly timeless knowledge, and that it exists as a form of intuition. On the other hand, he perceives the passage of time as a kind of flaw, and something that truly authoritative knowledge ought to avoid. Jensen has suggested that I have a bourgeois view of philosophy. Now, I've introduced as my second example of a philosophical problem, a question which, even if you grant that it is perhaps philosophical and that it may be of significance to physics and mathematics, will still seem of no importance for the issues that Marxism deals with. Here I must anticipate a misunderstanding. Predictably, time after time on the list, when I emphasize the importance of natural science to philosophy, I have been accused of, quote, scientism, unquote, and of believing that either Marxism or philosophy should be, quote, scientific, unquote. When I would say that Lenin's use of the term materialism and his view of the relationship between materialism and idealism is quite different from what Chris says, it has been assumed that I am concerned with defending materialism. Or else the issue has been attributed to my peculiar personal interest. But the issue here is an historical and hermeneutical one. In Platypus 101, which you all know, you have learned that the problem of modern philosophy is the problem of freedom in bourgeois society. As Chris writes, quoting Chris, the need for, the necessity of philosophy in the modern world is different from its need previously, fundamentally different. The need to account for freedom in bourgeois emancipation was new and different. This did not motivate and inform traditional philosophy. That is indeed half of the problem of modern philosophy. But in this respect, Platypus 101 has simply neglected half of the story, I think, for quite understandable pedagogical reasons. You have learned, for example, if I may now use proper nouns as symbols, that Rousseau was a necessary background for Kant. Good background. But it has not been emphasized that Newton was just as necessary as the background. Let me again quote from Adorno. Quote, a prerequisite for understanding Kant that is absolutely involved in his philosophy is the fact that underlying Kant's philosophy lies a huge confidence in the mathematical natural sciences, and that his philosophy is absolutely full of the spirit of those sciences. If we wish to grasp the chief inspiration of the Critique of Pure Reason, we might locate it at the idea that the attempts of metaphysics to arrive at absolute certainties by spinning them out of mere thought have all failed, and Hume was right to criticize them.
Please speak up.
And Hume was right to criticize them. But this does not mean that we should despair, because thanks to the persuasive force of the mathematical sciences, particularly mathematics itself, and what today we would call theoretical physics, we possess an entire body of knowledge that actually does satisfy the criterion of absolute truth. Kant's achievement only becomes comprehensible on the assumption that science provides the absolute knowledge which merely abstract speculation have failed to deliver. What Adorno says here about Kant, and which indeed is so clear in Kant, is, however, true of the entire arc of modern philosophy. It is, I would argue, inseparable from the rise of modern science. This is just as true, say, for a Heidegger, whose attitude towards physics and its relationship to metaphysics is the exact opposite of Kant's. When Heidegger says science does not think, he in effect defines philosophy against science. In either case, sympathetic and admiring, or hostile and disdainful, philosophy inevitably faces science, just as it once faced and still faces religion. A certain type of intellectual prejudice still tends to tell the history of philosophy as internal to philosophy. One correction to that is to emphasize the social character of philosophy, that ideas, even extremely abstract ones, come from people living in particular social situations. This idea is, of course, well established in Platypus, almost too well established, since there is a tendency to subsume the actual ideas into the social circumstances that give rise to them. There is, however, another blindness to the context of philosophical ideas, namely that philosophy as a discipline has from the beginning coexisted with religion, from which it originally separated, and with an ever more dominant natural science, which separated from philosophy in bourgeois society. So on one side of philosophy lies prayer to a terrible or merciful God, and on the other, differential equations and neuroscience. To understand philosophy without understanding its relationship with these two powerful neighbors is like telling the history of Poland without mentioning Germany and Russia. The two categories, I'm using category in a somewhat different sense here than Kant would use it, that define modern bourgeois life are society and nature. Neither category existed in its modern form before the rise of bourgeois society, but neither category has been assimilable to the other. Marxism and Marxist philosophy have not been immune to this particular duality of bourgeois thought. On the one hand, Marxism is the greatest result of the rise of bourgeois society and its crisis, and Marxist thought is obviously centered on social, historical, and political problems, which are treated as having a primary character. It is also, however, rooted in a naturalistic worldview, which simultaneously emphasizes the logical and ontological priority of a material world. Marxism inherits both the legacy of German idealism through Hegel and that of 18th century French materialism, just as in the political realm, it took up both the criticism of the Jacobins by Hegel and Constant, but also, while rejecting a direct imitation of the Jacobins, assumed the role of their political heir. In this way, Marx's understanding of history is rooted in Hegel, but he comes to political conclusions that end up contradicting Hegel. One can, of course, see this as Hegel understanding his time and Marx his time. But the most perplexing claims made for Marxism are those explaining the relationship of Marx to Hegel at the metaphysical level. Hegelian dialectics were idealist, we are told, but Marxist ones are materialist. One almost feels that Hegel here functions as a kind of Old Testament to the Marxist New Testament, which completes it, except that whereas the Christian biblical narrative proceeds from the Jews circumcised in the flesh to Christians circumcised in the spirit, the movement from Hegel to Marx proceeds the other way around. From Hegel and spirit to Marx in matter and flesh. Like psychoanalysis, Marxism is both naturalistic and spiritual. Unlike traditional spiritual visions, Marxism and psychoanalysis seek redemption not by rejecting an unclean material world of sex drives and economics, but rather by seeking their transformation. The only true spirituality for both is through the material world and not outside it or beyond it. But what is this, quote, material, unquote, world of Marxism? Here it must be admitted is considerable ambiguity. Marxist emphasis on a natural background to social reality sometimes functions like a poorly painted stage set, meant to vaguely suggest a setting, but not distract attention from the actors. Or perhaps a better analogy is a picture frame. On the one hand, the contemplation of the frame must not distract from the painting, but it is necessary for the picture to be displayed on the wall at all. But the frame itself is not of great importance, only the fact of the frame, which is of tremendous importance. But an inappropriately chosen picture frame can also distract one from the painting it surrounds. It is not accidental that the philosophical arguments which I have had with classical Marxist texts are precisely those which involve the relationship of Marxist philosophy to natural science, such as Materialism and Imperial Criticism by Lenin and Dialectics and Nature of Engels. Chris has written, Marxism was not a philosophical critique of philosophy, but rather something else entirely. For instance, Marx and Engels' critique of the young Hegelians was not as philosophers, but in their philosophical claims for politics. This was also true of Lenin's critique of the Machians among the Bolsheviks in Materialism and Imperial Criticism in 1908. The critique was of the relationship between philosophy and politics. It was thus also not a political critique of philosophy. Now, I agree wholeheartedly with the first two propositions, but disagree strongly with the third. Materialism and Imperial Criticism can only, I think, be read as precisely that, namely as a politically motivated critique of philosophical views. In fact, though, what is significant about it is really not its philosophical content, but that with the prestige of Lenin's name attached, it established a position that one could not directly criticize without being seen as anti-Leninist. Recently, Chris directed me to a curious piece by Korsch after Korsch had in fact become anti-Leninist. In it, he attacks materialism and imperial criticism, but here the methodology is inverted, and Lenin's philosophical attack on Marx is seen as, quote, representative of the ideology of the state capitalist bourgeoisie, quote, and much other nonsense. If for Korsch apparently to be a Leninist is to agree with Lenin in philosophy, then to be an anti-Leninist must be to disagree with Lenin in philosophy. This is, despite my great respect for Lenin and my considerable respect for Korsch, a way I do not want to do philosophy. Against Jensen's emphasis on the importance of correct philosophical thinking, I must appear anti-philosophical and philistine. Against Chris's orthodox affirmation of the coherence of the Marxist tradition, I offer a far more skeptical reading of the intellectual history of Marxism. Unlike both of them, I am more struck by the force of a problem than the sense of an answer. I became interested in philosophy at an early age before I became interested in Marxism, and I read Plato and Kant before Marx. I was drawn to philosophy because I felt the force of certain questions of a metaphysical and epistemological character. I was drawn to Marxism because it simply seemed true to me as soon as I began to consider the society in which I lived. I did not, however, take seriously, indeed I consciously rejected Marxism as philosophy. Now, though, like the narrator of Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, for whom there were two paths that seemed to have nothing to do with each other, a côté de mes églises, chez Swann, and a côté de Germain. These were philosophy and Marxism for me. In time, however, just as Proust's narrator discovers that the two paths, which he as a child imagined went in opposite directions, actually intersected further on, I too have increasingly felt, especially after my years in Platypus, that my interest in philosophy and Marxism are interrelated at some deep level. This, however, is, as I said earlier, merely a statement of the problem. But I've taken too much time already. Salviati, Sagredo, and Simplicio, the characters in the famous dialogue by Galileo, had 4 full days in a Venetian palace to talk. Chris, Jensen, and I only have a few hours in this class.
All right, so I've been working on this for a few weeks. It's a little bit more fragmentary than I would want it to be because of the conversations we've been having in the thread and just a bunch of different questions that have been raised, especially by Teo, and feeling the need to respond to as many of them as possible. So I hope it's not too incoherent. I've called my remarks Marx's contribution to philosophy. Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy poses the crucial question of the relation of philosophy to society and history, and as its title suggests, to Marxism as the self-consciousness of bourgeois society in crisis. Korsch's central thesis is that the evolution of philosophy in the 19th century was not a purely ideal development, but an expression of the transformation of society. According to Korsch, it is in the Hegelian system, the crowning conclusion of German idealism, that philosophy becomes conscious of its own historical status. In his critique of Kant, for example, Hegel shows that the Kantian practical philosophy is not a trans-historical metaphysics of morals, but a theoretical codification of the ethical dynamic of modern society. Hegel's philosophy, in its articulation of the historical idea of freedom, brought to speech the revolutionary nature of the bourgeois class and its ideals of individual autonomy and democratic self-determination. Yet whereas the Hegelian critique of Kant was still a philosophical critique, Marx's critique of Hegel, on Korsch's account, lay in the practical critique of bourgeois society itself, that is, in the proletarian struggle for socialism. The disintegration of the bourgeois revolution following the Industrial Revolution required not just interpretation, but transformation. In Marx's hands, philosophy ceases to be merely retrospective and contemplative, but becomes prospective and practical. The Hegelian notion of dialectical contradiction is no longer grasped as a constitutive feature of reality, but is recast as the historically specific contradiction of labor under capital. Overcoming and completing Hegel would thus require overcoming and completing capitalism as such, or so Korsch claims. Now, as I've already made clear, Korsch's account is indispensable, especially as a defense of one of the most contested aspects of Marxism, its Hegelianism. Nevertheless, I also believe that Korsch, following Marx, fails to fully grasp the significance of Hegel's achievement, a failure that has major implications for the idea that philosophy must be both realized and abolished. Part of the difficulty here is that there is virtually no way to adequately address the relevant issues in Korsch without taking a deep dive into Hegel and asking unavoidably technical questions concerning what it means to provide a philosophy and even a logic of freedom. I will try to very briefly summarize what I take to be one of Hegel's most staggering philosophical moves, his attempt to show that logic and metaphysics are inseparable but distinguishable enterprises. This is an entirely novel proposition and moves beyond Kant's finite idealism in significant ways. Since Aristotle, metaphysics has sought to answer the question of what there is, the question of being or substance, ousia. Hegel's logic purports to sublate the opposition between Aristotelian realism and Kantian idealism by showing that the subjective conditions for the possibility of experience are also the objective conditions for the possibility of the objects of experience. Hegel's idea is that an adequate account of pure thought will just thereby be an adequate account of what there can be, since for thought to be thought, it must be the thought of objects. While Hegel himself would be the first to tell us, and indeed was the first to tell us, that philosophy is its own time grasped in thought, these logical claims are not historical claims, but purport to make sense of how we make sense of anything, including the idea of radical historical change itself. Neither Korsch nor Marx addresses these claims in Hegel, or when Marx does address Hegel's logic, he tends to misread Hegel as a Neoplatonist and hyper-idealist, claiming, for instance, that Hegel forced historical reality to correspond to the requirements of the concept, rather than deriving the concept from historical actuality. There are very good reasons to reject such a reading of Hegel, and it is crucial that greater attention be paid to what Hegel is trying to do in the logic, not because of its independent scholarly interest, but because of what it can tell us about what is required of critical theory, and perhaps improbably, even of a Marxist politics. But I will try to address these issues indirectly, by way of Korsch. I want to briefly take up the following claim in Marxism and philosophy. Quote, "It appears as if in the very act of surpassing the limits of the bourgeois position, an act indispensable to grasp the essentially new philosophical content of Marxism, Marxism itself is at once superseded and annihilated as a philosophical object." Korsch is suggesting here that Marxism is superseded and annihilated as a philosophical object insofar as its standpoint is no longer contemplative and interpretive, but practical and transformative. Philosophy supersedes itself in Marxism by grasping itself as a material force, as the standpoint of the proletariat, as Lukacs puts it. But if this were really the case, then critical theory can give no account of its own procedure. Not only could it give no account of what counts as immanent critique, it would also be unable to account for what can count as an object of immanent critique. What is an institutional ideal such that there can be a discrepancy between an institution and its practices? What is a practice? What is a rational kernel? What is reason? What Korsch fails to grasp is that we require some account of how to account for institutional failure, social contradiction, emancipatory potential, and rationality itself. We need to know, for instance, what it means for something to be actual, what it means for something to be essential rather than merely apparent, and we need to know what it means to distinguish success from failure. Without some account of the justifiability of such discriminations, we would at best beg the question of such a thing as critical theory, and at worst, get it wrong altogether. Now I want to make one brief point about Korsch's interpretation of Hegel. Late in his essay, Korsch distinguishes between Hegel's conception of practice and Marx's conception. Korsch characterizes practice in Hegel as conceptual activity, which he juxtaposes with Marx's notion of practice as sensuous activity. This points to a deep problem that Korsch inherits from Marx and that reflects a shared misunderstanding of the Hegelian enterprise. Far from understanding practice as conceptual as opposed to sensuous, Hegel understands conceptual activity as an embodied form of rationality. Accordingly, for Hegel, for sensuous activity to be genuinely social activity, it must be conceptually constrained. Hegel then is not opposing the concept to real human practices, but is rather providing a theoretical account of what can count as a human practice. There's one further issue raised by Teo that I'll address in Korsch, and it's the issue of the disintegration of Hegelianism in the 19th century and the anti-Hegelianism of the 20th. On my account, the emergence of figures like Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard is a symptom of the failure of socialism, while Heidegger and eventually the post-structuralists are symptoms of the failure of Marxism and thus of the further decay of bourgeois society under late capitalism. But as Adorno puts it in his short book on Hegel, these symptoms also indicate that we have fallen back behind Hegel, that the philosophical discourse of late capitalist modernity has become inadequate to what philosophy itself is supposed to be. Adorno famously tells us that philosophy lives on because the chance for its realization was missed, but it lives on in a deficient form. Foucauldian genealogy is the incoherent substitute for the Hegelian recollection of past spiritual failures. Fundamental ontology, or the Heideggerian philosophy of finitude, displaces Hegel's modernist project of deducing the actuality of reason, its progressive realization over the course of human history, and its self-authorizing nature. There is a real question, then, as to whether philosophy actually does live on, as Adorno thought. It increasingly seems that the one-sided negation of philosophy has already occurred, in the form of contemporary anti-philosophy, from Wittgensteinian quietism to Heideggerian nihilism, from Foucauldian historicism to new materialism and affect theory. But this raises a further question about Marx and Engels' own materialism, and what Hegel remains undigested and even misunderstood within it. Were the later vulgarizations of Marx purely contingent, or did they owe something to a repression by Marx of certain philosophical elements, as Adorno himself sometimes seems to suggest? The wager of Hegel's philosophical modernism lies in his belief that in bourgeois society, philosophy can attain to absolute knowing, the knowledge that we are the source of the authority of our norms, and that reality is dependent on us for its very intelligibility as reality. Hegel took his logic not, as Marx thought, to establish conditions to which reality must adhere. Rather, what Hegel's logic establishes are the conceptual conditions for undertaking an immanent critique. Hegel's notion of the idea as the unity of universal, individual, and particular renders intelligible the very possibility of rendering any social form intelligible as a social form. So the proper critique of Hegel on the state, for instance, is not that the emergence of the modern state is a product of disembodied reason, as if a result of the blueprint provided by the concept. Rather, the proper critique is that Hegel could not yet see that bourgeois society is inadequate to itself. Hegel was not wrong, consequently, to attempt a justification of modern institutional life by appeal to his logic, which aims to specify the conceptual criteria that enable critical theory to ask whether an institution is actually what it purports to be. In fact, I would go so far as to say that Marx's own procedure of immanent dialectical critique of measuring bourgeois society against itself just is Hegel's speculative method, applied under radically different historical circumstances. Face Korsch, Hegel is not attempting to reconcile reason to reality, but is claiming that a truly free form of life would admit of a philosophical account of its reconciled status. That philosophical enterprise does not exclude the political enterprise of bringing such a state about. Philosophy is a source of power for critical theory, whose role is filled in Hegel's system by his real philosophy, the philosophy of right, the philosophy of nature, the philosophy of spirit. Where Marx and Korsch both go wrong is to think that philosophy's negation and fulfillment will lie in the overcoming of philosophy, its withering away under new conditions. What both thinkers would need to have shown is how Hegel's logic of spiritual self-constitution must itself be revised in light of the proletarian struggle for socialism. What remains inadequately grasped by Hegel and his logic is the way in which spirit is just as much prospective as retrospective. It not only recollects itself through comprehension of past failure, but empties itself into the world in light of the principles that govern what it is trying to be. But this does not invalidate the project of the logic or suggest that the only possible revision of the logic is practical and political in nature, as if the fulfillment of the ideal of communism would itself cancel out the possibility of a philosophical explanation of what communism had achieved. What it suggests is that the negation and fulfillment of philosophy will itself be philosophical rather than extra-philosophical, a determinate negation of what philosophy has been rather than an annihilation of philosophy in and through its transition to scientific socialism, as Korsch claims. Marx's original contribution to philosophy wasn't just his idea that philosophy is overcome in scientific socialism. Rather, his original contribution was to grasp the inadequacy of a purely retrospective approach to questions of society and history. Critical theory requires philosophy because without philosophy, critical theory couldn't give an account of what actually counts as critical theory. We would need to be able to adjudicate between Foucault's discursive historicism, Althusserian materialism, and Marx's account of the self-contradiction of bourgeois society under capitalism. One could counter that what's really at issue is the political viability of these different theories. And while that's true, this is where philosophy makes its indispensable contribution on the side of theory and ideological critique. If those theories are politically unviable, we still need some account of what could count as political viability, and that is a distinctly philosophical task.
So let's have one round of responses to each other, and then we'll turn to Teo and Reid to kick off the discussion.
Teo and Reid, is that okay?
Yeah. They're still there?
Are you there? Can you hear us? Hello?
Yeah, so
Yes.
that's Reid. Is Teo there?
There's a significant delay between the Skype and the live stream.
Okay, that's okay though. Yeah. So I had a response to both what Richard and Jensen raised, and somewhat to my surprise, I'm going to bring in maybe a theological question, namely, reason in Auschwitz. It seems like the specter of fascism is haunting this discussion a little bit. Also in Jensen's presentation. I feel like I'm tasked with invoking the spirit of Marx Stone, actually, in this respect. Namely, that socialism is fascism. So I'll address that in two different ways. One is that Richard is raising the contradiction between progress in science and retrogression of society. In other words, the science seems to continue to progress. Our knowledge of the natural physical world continues to progress, and also technique, our mastery of nature, seems to progress while society retrogresses. And that's what Auschwitz and Hiroshima signify. And that if philosophy is Poland between Germany and Russia, then Germany would be the advancement of science, and Russia would be the retrogression of society, right? Or vice versa. Who knows, right? It's Tolstoy, right? With Jensen, it comes down to the question of practice. And I don't think that we need an account of practice. I don't think we have an account of practice, and that's bourgeois philosophy. Because the struggle for socialism, the dictatorship of the proletariat, will appear to be barbarism. From any bourgeois perspective, it is barbarism. It's not practice, but rather the violation of practice. So I'm reminded, of course, by how the New Left tries to reconcile Marxism and Carl Schmitt. and how people inevitably look to people like Georges Sorel when thinking about Lenin. And Benjamin's critique of violence, his category of divine violence, right? Political violence could be theological violence in the sense of divine violence, that it establishes its right by fiat. So Marx, what did Marx have to say about this? What Marx said about the class struggle in capitalism was that it was when right meets right, when right meets right, force will decide. In other words, that both the capitalists and the proletariat, the working class, in industrial capitalism, both had bourgeois right on their side. But that force will decide. And why do I bring this up? I don't want to say that Marxism is voluntarism, an act of will, an act of force, some kind of enactment of divine violence. I don't want to say that. However, I do want to say it will necessarily appear so. So what we need is not an account, namely a description, or even an analysis of practice, but rather a critique of practice. So this is the way in which the struggle for socialism both is based on and affirms the bourgeois revolution while also negating it. Actually, it's the question of socialism that makes the bourgeois revolution itself paradoxically appear as a logical culmination of human enlightenment and freedom and an arbitrary act of will. So the French Revolution. Why does the French Revolution haunt us? Why does Jacobinism haunt us? I think that it's right to recognize that Hegel would reject the dictatorship of the proletariat. That Robert Pippin,
Or socialism.
well, it depends on how you define socialism. Depends on how you define socialism. He may not have rejected the attempts of the utopian socialists in the same way that Thomas Jefferson accepted the attempts of the utopian socialists. It's really the question of, right meeting right and force deciding. And I think in that respect, what Marxism is not a self-consciousness of a kind of necessary advance in bourgeois practice, but rather a critical self-consciousness of the crisis of bourgeois practice, which the struggle for socialism still is. So why did I invoke Poston? Because of course Poston thinks that not only was the October Revolution, the act of the Bolsheviks, a 1789 style revolution, but in a bad sense, in the sense of Jacobinism. He also thought that this was true of the Nazi seizure of power, that the Nazi seizure of power was also a Jacobin moment.
But Marx admired the
Who did?
Marx admired the Jacobin.
Sure. Moish.
Marx admired.
Yeah, I said Moish.
I know.
Yeah, of course. So that's the problem that we have to kind of wrap our minds around. In other words, it's, are we completing Hegel? Are we annihilating Hegel? This kind of language, like that you get from Korsch or from Marxism in general, really, poses this question. I think Kautsky made fun of Korsch by saying Korsch even calls for a philosophical dictatorship, right? He sort of mocked that idea. Again, the question is, what does that mean? Right? What does it mean that both the capitalists and the workers have right on their side? Still to this day. Right? Not only in the 1840s, but still to this day. I think that Richard said, unlike the bourgeoisie of the 19th or even the early 20th century, the bourgeoisie today doesn't need to be philosophical. I would say the bourgeoisie never needed to be philosophical, ever. Right? No one needed Hegel to make the bourgeois revolution. And the problem with the bourgeois revolution was not that it was inadequately Hegelian, which would be like a Pippin response to the Jacobins. Right? Hegel himself, though he critiqued the Jacobins, considered Jacobinism to have been necessary. To have been necessary, but no longer be necessary. So the question is, why does Jacobinism become necessary again? Why wasn't Hegel right about the inadequacy of Jacobinism? He was right about the inadequacy of Jacobinism, but if we take Hegel's critique of Jacobinism seriously today, we would have to reject the struggle for socialism.
Just something on that last point, I guess. It seems to me, though, that with respect to the question of Jacobinism, that Hegel's critique of Jacobinism as a form of voluntarism, that's still very distinct from at least Marxism's self-understanding. So, I mean, the very notion of immanent dialectical critique to which Marxism appeals as the source of its justification for pursuing the project of socialism, which is to say that, you know, we're appealing to the bourgeois ideals that already have motivational force for those in bourgeois society. You know, and that's the justification for Marxism, but this isn't just a bald assertion of what ought to be the case.
No, of course not.
So
it's real.
It's real, it's actual.
But so is the capitalist asserting the right of capital. So is that, because as Kant says, we're all as humans tasked with building an edifice that we do not ourselves have the benefit of inhabiting. So in other words, there will always be a justification by the capitalists to say the struggle of the workers endangers the accumulated capital of society that must be preserved as a legacy for posterity. Right? It will always appear that it's an untoward act of political will. And they will be justified in regarding it as such.
As an appearance. But
that's all we have. We don't have, you said something about essence and appearance.
But that's the distinction, the distinction that Marxism has to make, to say that yes, it appears this way, but what we have to regard as essential, you know, is the motivational force that these ideals, you know, have, and their inadequacy, the inadequacy of these ideals themselves under present conditions. I mean, that's if it's part of the distinction I take Marxism to be making, and why it's not just voluntarism, is that it's making a claim as to what should be counted as essential.
I would say Kant and Hegel already dispatched the essence-appearance distinction. In other words, we only work in appearances. Appearances are essential. I think that Marx had another kind of idea, which is that both the working class and the capitalists, though they both had bourgeois right on their side, would, for structural reasons, find themselves in a blind alley. In other words, there is something of Marx, the inevitability of socialism, meaning the inevitability of the crisis of capitalism. I think Engels said that he expected the definitive crisis to come in the 1890s and then socialism would be achieved. That's fine. You know, I'm not going to dispute them on that. But I am going to say, in 2018, we know that the cycle has repeated itself a few times. Right? In other words, they thought that it would essentially be a mutual desperation of the capitalists and workers, which would yield socialism. What we've learned is that there is no extremis point that will be reached, and that's what the image of Auschwitz and Hiroshima gives us.
So I wanted to respond. So I mean, that Auschwitz image came up because I was like out of my subconscious and I remember this anecdote. But I think that actually the real philosophical intellectual crisis for Marxism is the Bolshevik Revolution and Stalinism. And it's precisely the actual historical crisis that kind of overwhelmed both Lukacs and Korsch in opposite directions, because they really neither of them could cope with the rise of Stalinism as coming from the Bolshevik Revolution. So Lukacs came into Stalinism, Korsch became anti-Leninist. Whereas Trotsky, who was a complete Philistine in philosophy, basically, except for using an opportunistic, well, it's my view.
Okay.
I mean, I think so. He was not interested in philosophy. He didn't really, compared to Lukacs and Korsch, grasp it politically. Right? Again, I'm suggesting that this is different. I think that the only way that Stalinism can be understood, right? The question about what Jacobinism went back is because of the Bolshevik Revolution.
By the way, Trotsky calls fascism the regurgitation of the undigested filth of the bourgeois society.
Right.
And I think that most Trotskyists read that as some kind of revenge of like the pre-bourgeois past. But I think that what Trotsky meant was Jacobinism. In other words, he meant that all the storm and drang of the emergence of bourgeois society sort of re-emerges.
I don't think so, and I think that actually, like, Nazism would have been anti-Jacobinism.
Well, in their own, yes.
And so, but the point I'm making is that
the question is, what would Hegel have said about Nazis?
That's a good question. And
I think he would have said,
I mean, and again, you know, it was a
bad repetition of the French Revolution.
But it was also, again, like an accusation, I think, completely unfairly leveled with Hegel in the mid-20th century.
That Hegel was responsible for fascism.
That Hegel's, which I think is complete rubbish. And there was a quip, I was quoting this, you know.
It's not complete rubbish, the kernel of truth.
That's what Reid says, is that it's becoming, like that's the problem.
Oh, right.
And of course it is.
So
That's what
In
Reid
2018, nothing is complete rubbish because everything is.
Well, anyway, so there was a quip, you know, that the Battle of Stalingrad was between the left Hegelians and right Hegelians, right?
Yeah.
But there's
of course
a
we would.
And you know, I was talking to Chris, and I said, well, in some way, by losing the point of that quip, there's already been a loss since the mid-20th century. But the thing I'm saying is that the problem of Jacobinism in the 20th century is directly connected with the Bolshevik Revolution and its success, and it's also with the problem of Stalinism, and there's a contingent character to this, right? The problem is that to really understand the problem of regression and the failure of Marxism, right? So when I said, well, Marxism has failed and philosophy has failed, now the failure of philosophy, you could say, is a very deep failure, although maybe in modern times it's become something, a different type of failure. But the failure of Marxism raises in other words, it makes Marxism become a kind of philosophical problem. If I say to myself, I accept that Marxism describes the world, that it's true, then I have to ask myself, why is Marxism so ineffective? Right? In its own terms. It raises some kind of philosophical question about Marxism. Because to the extent that Marxism is true, it shouldn't be so ineffective. It shouldn't be threatened with obliteration. Right? There is this aspect to the contingency of history and the history of Marxism in the 20th century that in some particular way raises the question of philosophy. And I'm not articulating a position, I'm just sort of pointing to where...
What I'm reminded of is at the convention this year, at the plenary, when I was talking about the century of counter-revolution, someone in the audience, an oldly leftist, a friend of Mitchell Cohen, she said, well, if Marxism has failed, would you also say that Hegel has failed? And I just said, obviously so, right? In other words, yes, like clearly. And you know, so she was basically trying to say, well, you can't say Marxism has failed because you can't say Hegel has failed, you can't say the bourgeois revolution has failed. And yet, you must, right? In other words, these things are all bound up together. You can't actually separate it out. And again, the task is, you know, you can't rest on something. You can't say, okay, this is achieved, and we have this as our foundation, and then we proceed from there. The problem with regression is that it undermines the very foundation.
Okay, so I have a question for Jensen, which is related to when you were talking about Hegel's logic. Now, as I understand it from the things you've written, you see Hegel's logic as expressing a trans-historical truth about conditions of thought, which reading of the logic I agree with, right? Yeah. But that then raises the question of how you see the relevance of that to empirical history or politics. Because that's where, and obviously I'm vastly less sympathetic to Hegel than you are, Chris is, but that's where your analysis seems to break down. In other words, you seem to be reading Marx from the standpoint of Hegel and saying, well, Hegel doesn't, or Marx doesn't get Hegel from a Hegelian standpoint would, I guess, be true. But again, it always seems to me that you're judging Marx from the standpoint of Hegel, right?
Well, it cuts both ways, yes, but also that there are deficiencies internal to, I guess, to the Marxist self-conception of what he's doing that has to do with his relations with Hegel. So it's not just that I'm, reading him against Hegel, but also reading him against himself in light of the method that Hegel's articulating.
But the fundamental flaw in Marx.
What would be some examples?
Yeah, like what is it that you see in Marx as failing other than disagreeing with him?
Well, I think that it has more to do with, the way that he understands. This is just a strictly. This is more on the side of the methodological issue, but the way that Marx understands, materialism, the way that the critique that he undertakes of Hegel and Hegel's method, especially in the early critique of philosophy of right. And it has to do also, with the passages that Teo recently quoted from the Grundrisse, where Marx is describing what concrete universality means from his perspective versus what it means from the Hegelian perspective, and Marx does tend to think that he's inverting Hegel's method, and that whereas Hegel is imposing conceptual constraints on historical reality, that Marx himself is doing some sort of historical derivation of what these conceptual constraints are. But from a Hegelian perspective, that's question begging, because it's not asking, well, what do you mean when you're talking about concrete universality? What do you mean when you're talking about rationality? What do you mean when, in the letter to Ruger, when Marx says that he wants to start from the principles, that already constrain what we're committed to politically, and that we have to critique historical reality on that basis. We can't start from, principles that we impose, but we have to undertake a critique of what's already there. Hegel wouldn't disagree with any of this, and Hegel would see it as his actual method rather than as an inversion of what he's doing.
You think that Hegel would agree with Marx? I find that hard to believe.
On these specific questions, yes.
The real movement of history.
The real movement of history.
Yeah, real movement of history.
But it seems to me that Marx does an active translation that necessarily does a kind of violence to Hegel's system. And also, in terms of the whole movement of the 19th century thought, it's not as though anybody seems able to preserve Hegel entire after Hegel. It seems to Marx and reject other parts. Or you have people who reject Hegel, but then they reject Hegel in different ways.
Well, that's exactly what Adorno said that we shouldn't do. In the very first page of the 3 Hegel essays, he says the mistake is to ask what's dead or alive in Hegel, rather than to ask the question of what the present means in the face of Hegel, and how the present itself is failing to fulfill the Hegelian conception of rationality.
But even Adorno, right, by reading Hegel in a Marxist lens, right, and even Pippin, right, all of them are taking something from Hegel, taking some aspect of reading Hegel, it seems to me, in some way that dispenses with some part of the totality of Hegel. I don't see that there's like a complete Hegelianism that survives Hegel in any form.
Pippin is probably the closest thing, but
I think
Pippin does
too. Don't you think Pippin does huge violence to Hegel from a Hegelian standpoint?
Well, in terms
he throws out the metaphysics, and
no, not at all. I mean, Pippin's very committed to the totality of the system.
Yeah. There's a phrase that came up: the self-movement of the concept. Right. In other words, this is idealism, materialism, and so I feel like Richard, what you're saying is that Marx engages in an active translation, that he translates Hegel's ideal categories as material categories. I feel like, okay, well, that's one way of describing it, but it actually doesn't do justice to it, because then it sets up a kind of a false dichotomy. So you could say,
yes, but the false dichotomy, I mean, it's true that the characterization of the problem in terms of idealism and materialism is philosophically unsatisfactory, but, which I agree with. But it's also the formulation that Marx and Engels and the Marxist tradition therefore inherits.
well, they use that language. But what I was going to say about the self-limit of the concept, you could say that capitalism is two things. Capitalism is the self-limit of the concept, and capitalism is the destruction of the movement of the concept, meaning it's the self-destruction of the movement of the concept. And so that's, you know, again, it all depends on what we mean by the concept, and when Marx says things like Hegel appears to, you know, derive reality from the concept rather than derive the concept from reality, that's only one side of it, because then he'll turn around and also say that Hegel's method is the correct one.
There's a wonderful line of Ferdinand Tönnies. He said of Hegel, it was a complaint, but it's actually a kind of praise, even though it's in front of the complaint. He said, sein Wesen war Zweideutigkeit, kannte so und kannte auch anders. His essence was kind of ambiguity or twofoldness. He could do it this way, or he could do it the other way.
Ay, ay, ay. All right, let's open it up. Let's see what Teo and Reid
on the Facebook.
Hello? Can you guys hear us? Can you talk? Hello? Hello?
Go to
Yes.
your notifications.
So you guys can hear us all?
And there should be Aaron. Aaron is live. And click on the video. Oh, there they are.
Oh, he's not on the screen. Okay. Does he want to get back on or what?
So Reid's just putting like quotes on there with some.
I don't know.
He started with
That we can
the
process.
contingency.
I can't process that.
Obviously something so I knew.
Because I'm hearing like 3 or 4 different repetitions of the same thing when I
Oh.
talk through Skype.
Okay, so we'll just...
So Teo is asking, how is Marx's understanding of Hegel, incomplete according to Jensen, contributed to this? How has it contributed to the success or the failure of Marxism? How a different approach to Hegel would help the struggle for socialism today?
How a different approach to Hegel would affect the struggle for socialism.
Right.
Good question.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the million-dollar question.
Well, just provisionally.
Yeah.
I make sure to speak up just so they can hear.
Sure.
Thanks.
On the first part of the question, I sort of suggested this in our private conversation, and this relates to what Richard just asked. But I do wonder if the inadequacies, you know, in the self-understanding of materialism and the ambiguities about the relation to Hegel, and, you know, a certain failure maybe to fully own, you know, Marx's own egalitarianism, or what I'm sort of referring to is Marx's misreading, you know, Hegel as a Neoplatonist or whatever, especially in the early Marx, that if that itself isn't a repressed aspect of Marxism that, you know, contributed to the later sort of appropriation led to the vulgarization of materialism. If that sort of the undigested elements of idealism in Marx's own self-understanding, that doesn't, in a way, you know, come back later. The specter of, you know, Hegel's thought and the inadequacy of Marx to fully understand the idealist aspects of his own theory isn't paid for, you know, later with precisely, you know, the Lenin text on materialism and these sorts of accounts. And this isn't to say that I mean, I see philosophy as necessary but not sufficient to Marxism. You know, philosophy on its own, right thinking on its own, isn't going to lead to the correct political program but there is a necessity, there always is a philosophical presupposition in any political commitment. I mean, Chris has said as much in his pieces on Lukacs and philosophy in general. So that's one part of it. As for, I mean, maybe this is a cop-out answer, but as to how philosophy can contribute to socialist politics now, again, I just wonder if the sorts of the forms of justification that Hegelian logic makes available, the kinds of argumentative resources that it provides for thinking about the question of immanent dialectical critique, what counts as an adequate critical theory, that given historical regression, given what Richard said about Marxism having become a philosophical problem, if these sorts of Hegelian questions don't become more important now, precisely because of the incredible abstract situation that we're in. I mean, Lukacs, Chris has said this before, about how history and class consciousness, that was already a symptom of the decline, that sort of abstraction.
Crisis of Marxism.
Exactly. And yeah, this return to Hegel and the need to return to the sorts of justifications that Hegel provides in the logic. I mean, that's also a symptom, but that doesn't preclude its value. But it might be one of the only tools, resources we have now for making the case for a revitalized Marxism, socialism, etc. So that's the vision answer.
Erin?
Yeah, so I was wondering, kind of on these points that you're bringing up, if you could maybe respond to something that Chris posted at the beginning of his presentation, which is about the ideological character of philosophy in modernity, because something that's just kind of confused me in this entire discussion is the way that it has seemed to me, maybe I'm wrong, then please correct me, that in your account philosophy has kind of a straightforward autonomous existence that we don't have to worry about, that philosophy can stand on its own as a answer to the problem of the disintegration of the theory-practice dialectic, for example, within Marxism. And so I think, to me, what this doesn't take into account, which you yourself brought up in your presentation, is, for example, the way that Adorno addresses philosophy, or the kind of recrudescence of philosophy's ghost in the 20th century, or also the poverty of philosophy, which Chris brought up in his presentation. So if it does seem to be a need to return to philosophy due to kind of the abstractness of the situation, or the extent to which theory and practice have kind of been just completely torn asunder, how do we deal with the fact that philosophy no longer appears to have its own autonomous basis and actually must be subordinated to something else?
Please.
So it seems to me that talking about the Hegel is sort of a revival of interest in Hegel, early 20th century, I'm not sure. And then there's sort of an earlier wave associated with the new left, right, of the 60s and 70s. And it seems to me that whereas the earlier wave was associated with questions of Marxism, the latest wave seems essentially focused on finding a justification for them.
Yeah, that's totally true. I mean, there's one person, someone put it recently, Rebecca Comey, said that whereas Hegel, the question of Hegel used to be about left versus right, and now the discussion has become about metaphysical versus non-metaphysical, and that's the basic framing of the debate in contemporary philosophy. That's Pippin's whole innovation was originally provides deflationary reading, in which Hegel is non-metaphysical, etc. So that's
post-metaphysical.
Yes.
Post-metaphysical, which means both metaphysical and non-metaphysical.
Yeah.
That's good. I mean, you have to sort of keep these things in mind. That means something.
I have an inflationary reading.
You have a what?
An
inflationary reading.
Inflationary.
In a completely different way.
Yeah, so about the relation between, I guess, philosophy's autonomy and historical regression. Yeah, this is difficult because on the one hand, and this is something that I'm still, just to be fully honest, that I'm still thinking through, but on the one hand, I do think that one of the achievements of Kant and Hegel, and it's paradoxical on the face of it, is to say that, yes, on the one hand, philosophy is its own time grasped in thought, but at the same time, Hegel wants to say that, in modernity, for the first time, now we can actually give an account of, our freedom and the freedom of thought, and we can give an account of what that actually is, how to understand reason as such. So there is both a historical claim about the very possibility for his philosophical enterprise, but there's also a philosophical claim about the autonomy of philosophy itself, and how now we are in a position to understand, the history of philosophy, the truth of each part of the history of philosophy, and just to give an account of what pure thinking is. As that relates to the regression thesis and the return to Hegel, the split of theory and praxis, I guess I would just return to Adorno's point that just because we've fallen back behind Hegel now, that doesn't invalidate the Hegelian attempt to give an account of what pure thinking is.
It's a false, right? So we experience a false invalidation of Hegel.
Yeah, that's yeah, I think that's what I would say for now.
So we got the question from Dane up here for Chris. Both Pippin and Jensen on the list have provided ample sources to suggest that Hegel had in mind certain what you might call psychological elements with regards to recognition and the master-slave dialectic. In your article, you suggest that such approaches might be linked to what Lukacs recognized as reification in the academy. Did they both just get Hegel completely wrong, or are you maintaining that they are only looking at particular manifestations of Hegel's critique? Finally, if either is the case, can you perhaps ground it critically, i.e. account for why things might appear to them in this way?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure what I don't recall Jensen, but also Pippin resting on the master-slave dialectic and especially on the psychological dimensions of that. I think that one of the things that I recognized early on with Hegel and that Pippin has only more fully confirmed is that the master-slave dialectic refers to pre-bourgeois, or in the process, that the master-slave dialectic is an account of a bourgeois revolution. It's not an account of what goes on in bourgeois society. However, right, with Marxism we have wage slavery. In other words, it could very well be why the master-slave dialectic appears to dominate readings of Hegel in the 20th century seems to me straightforwardly to be about regression. In other words, that we regress. And this is what I tried to address in my presentation, which is to say that bourgeois society is constantly putting itself back together again, meaning that we're always achieving our country. Is that wordy or Rawls? It's wordy, right? Wordy? Yeah, wordy. I always confuse the two. It could be because they're two R's. In other words, that we're always tasked with completing the bourgeois revolution. However, the problem of capitalism, properly understood, is to go beyond the bourgeois revolution. So the way Marx put it, I referred to this and implied this, but didn't flesh it out. Marx said that there's the 16th century and the 19th century, and just how the 16th century brought bourgeois society into existence, the 19th century appears to be the repetition of the 16th century, but it will put an end to bourgeois society. Right? And it's also why he calls primitive accumulation the so-called primitive accumulation, meaning that, of course, the discovery of the New World, the flooding of Europe with silver and gold, the throwing of the peasants off the land was not the accumulation of capital, but that's the way it looks in the 19th century. Whereas the accumulation of capital in the 19th century does look like a repetition of the 16th century, and yet is not, right? So, again, in terms of, because master-slave dialectic is about recognition of labor and recognizing the essential character of the slave versus the inessential character of the master. That's psychology. I'm not sure what reification in the academy means with regard to that. I'm not sure.
Can I weigh in on something about that question? I think I know what the reference to the psychological probably has to do with. This has to do with the cognitive element. I guess that's. But I would just say that for Pippin and for me, whenever if I've on the list referred to recognition of master-slave dialectic. So in contemporary philosophy, there are people like Axel Honneth who ascribe psychological character to master-slave dialectic. They want to understand, this struggle for recognition, really in psychological terms, as the relationship between empirical subjects and how they encounter one another in social reality. Pippin does not understand the recognition question in terms of face-to-face encounter between empirical individuals. It's an institutional question. It's a question of what can count as adequate recognition. So I would just emphasize that it can sound, Pippin does want to emphasize the irreducible first personal, dimension of subjectivity for Hegel, but even that is still an institutional matter for him. It's not a psychological matter.
It's mediated.
It's mediated, yeah.
I wanted to say something about the overall problem of the history of philosophy. So it seems to me there are several moments of crisis in philosophy. So there is a particular break in modern philosophy that inaugurates modern philosophy with the 17th century. There's a different type of crisis, which you might say begins with Kant and ends with Hegel. That Hegel, in that sense, is the end and a beginning, and on the previous phase, beginning maybe particularly with Descartes. So that whatever one thinks about Hegel, Hegel is the kind of nodal point in the history of philosophy.
For everything that came after.
For everything that comes after. Which is something that I recognize, although I'm obviously the least Hegelian, not Hegelian necessarily at all, of the three of us. But what I would say is that in like the 20th century, right, and the late, the problem of philosophy is different. That you speak of sort of the Hegelian sense of summing up and understanding the history of all philosophy. I mean, to some extent, the idea that one can feel one can do that in the way that Hegel does seems odd to me, because it's clear to me that people like Pippin don't really feel that. That they find that somehow Hegel is still useful and speaks to them, but it's very different from Hegel's moment. There's a way in which Hegel was incredibly fortunate in the time that he lived. And the other thing that I wanted to say about philosophy is
my experience of Pippin is that he subordinates himself to Hegel. In other words, that he thinks we've regressed from Hegel. There is that.
But the sense that one has regressed from Hegel is not the same as feeling that one can get back to a Hegelian system or a Hegelian vantage.
But one can aspire.
That one aspires, but it's a different type of aspiration.
But you wouldn't then rewrite Hegel or something.
But
Right.
Pippin is saying, though, that if we can't do that, then so much the worse for us.
That's true. I understand that. But what I'm saying is that awareness of the so much for worse for us actually is a different type of consciousness from Hegel's own consciousness. It's
Certainly. The question is, how does that consciousness of we aspire to Hegel, but we can't achieve him, and so much for the worse for us, how does that relate to Marx?
It relates fundamentally.
Okay.
That's what I
So then address
that. Because I think that it's that sense of a
But
crisis.
Marx no longer poses it that way.
That it's a sense of that the crisis of philosophy in the 21st century is very much, I think, a kind of indirect crisis of the failure of Marxism, which is, I mean, particularly in what I might call a continental tradition, which emphasizes still some kind of link to history. But what I was going to say about the problem of philosophy is, you know, Pippin somewhere says that, you know, if you teach chemistry, you might, that if you're teaching chemistry, you don't begin by teaching people
The history of philosophy.
Right? But that somehow philosophy, and this is a fundamentally Hegelian point, but it's not only Hegelian because it's sort of been absorbed into the consciousness of what philosophy is. You have to understand the history of philosophy.
Analytics would be agreement.
No, analytic philosophy in that respect still maintains something like an ancient attitude, but in some respects it also maintains the attitude that one can sort of begin at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right? It's the rejection of history, but there it emphasizes language. But what I emphasize is that the whole problem of progress in philosophy, right? There is an assumption here, at least in the two of you, that there is some kind of clear progress and regression in philosophy. The problem that philosophy always faces, compared to sort of the positive sciences, is that there's no universally agreed upon body of knowledge or achievement, right? And in that sense, the narrative always comes up against the question of, has philosophy accomplished anything, right? It's like the famous example of, you know, it's the ironic example that Kierkegaard gives, where he talks about someone who goes sees a sign that says laundry done here, and then brings his laundry and then finds it's just a sign in a thrift shop, and the sign itself is for sale. And he analogizes that to the situation of philosophy. And when you speak about politics, then, you know, there's also the story that Heine tells, the beautiful passage where he says, well, you know, while the French were doing things in real life, the Germans were dreaming, right? And it's their dream that produced classical German philosophy, whereas it's the real world practical experience that produces the French Revolution. So you have then this question constantly of, like, well, what does this mean in a kind of concrete social realm? What is the, you know, and there's some part of me that just doubts that it has any. You know, I mean, if you look at the question of Stalinism, I mean, there is a great desire to see Stalinism as coming from some bad reading of Marx or misunderstanding of Marx. I would say it comes from contingent, external, empirical factors.
Well, let's bring it back to the dream and the act, which is to say that you could say that the problem with Stalinism is that it's delusional Marxism. Right?
But the fact that Stalinism triumphed is not really...
And you could also say the French Revolution, you could say the Jacobins were too jacked up on Locke and Rousseau. Right? That they had the dream, right? They had sort of the
But
dream
again, here's where I become kind of oddly materialist. I don't think that explains either. I don't think that, like, I don't. I think that the reason for the violence of the French Revolution has to do with, like, the social and political realities of the struggle. Of the struggle.
Not the bad ideas.
Not bad ideas. It wasn't Rousseau that, you know, is responsible for the guillotine, right? I don't think that that's the way philosophy works.
Nor is Lenin's materialism and empirio-criticism responsible for the purge of Soviet scientists.
It's not in the sense that, but here's what happened. It's not in that this was not Lenin's intention. Lenin never imposed a political orthodoxy in terms of philosophy. What happens, though, is that a spirit of piety towards received texts, whether Lenin or Hegel or Marx, impedes a certain type of historical discussion.
So we have,
Go ahead. Stephanie?
Notwithstanding my sort of
No, go ahead.
less than experience
Go ahead.
status. No, what I was saying is each time I'm hearing this about Marx has failed, I'm thinking, what does that mean exactly? And I'm thinking, if Marx was in the room right now, he knows, oh, Marx failed. You know, and it's kind of like tying in with all these other discussions about Hegel and everyone. It seems to me, on a certain level, he succeeded fantastically in the sense of he saw what he laid out as the problem. That problem has just continued to bloom,
Blossoms,
bloom,
yes.
bloom,
Yeah.
and to just like, you know.
But to understand the world without transforming it, that's the failure.
I mean, what I was going to say is,
But-
yeah.
I know, but we have, history is, it's living. Marxism is, in other words, we don't know. It's like what you were saying about, the problems with Leninism or whatever, and the way it just was not, mistakes were made or whatever. If we look at the world right now, there's a myriad of changes, right? There's all kinds of different boundaries, there's all kinds of different, so-called holy wars, and superficially, there's lots of differences. What the fuck? What has really changed?
I was going to say that all the problems of 20th century philosophy, I think Marx would have thought, to invoke Korsch, right? The arguments of the young Hegelians have largely been forgotten, and yet to return to them, one recognizes how much higher they are than any disputes today in philosophy. But the philosophical disputes of the young Hegelians were better than anything that came after, even though Marx himself disparaged them as a falling off from the master. Still, they stand higher than the subsequent philosophical disputes.
But they're within a very particular frame of assumption. That's where maybe I have...
Is it too particular?
Not if one is talking about Marxism, right? But if one is talking about what philosophy is or what it would aspire to be, right?
Then it's too narrow? How?
This goes back to the question of Hegel. When I was in the Sparks with you, around the Sparks, I was really reading a lot of Wittgenstein, and I was very drawn to Wittgenstein. Now, it never occurred to me that Wittgenstein would be of any use to Marxism. But that did not invalidate Wittgenstein to me.
It's not about being abused.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. That I think that understanding the question of philosophy in terms of transforming the world seems to me too narrow a vision of philosophy. Maybe that's because I have a bourgeois vision of philosophy. That a large part of philosophy is about the contemplation of the world, or being passed by a certain type of epistemological and ontological questions that continue to bother. To a large extent, the question of philosophy is what bothers you.
Mm-hmm.
What questions grab you? What do you want to think about, right?
The speculative
speculative
proposition is that questions of an apparently purely ontological or epistemological character are actually being provoked by social reality. In other words,
that
not
is
determined by, but provoked by.
Right, and that is the fundamental assumption that underlies this conversation.
Not constrained by.
I understand that, but the question of the sociological causation of questions, right, and the sociological roots of philosophy neglects the question of the truth values of philosophy. What is true, right? In fact, this is part of the problem with the question of
This is like Cartesianism and Kantianism, though, which is to say that first you have to ask the question of why you're asking the question of what is true.
The problem that I have with these conversations is that to me, Chris translates philosophical questions too much into a kind of rarefied sociology. It's like, what is happening in
sociology or social theory?
All right, social theory, use the terms you want. One of them, whereas I am still ask the question. For example, if you ask a question the question of synthetic a priori truth that preoccupies Kant is central to his philosophy. 7 plus 5 equals 12. Is that synthetic a priori, or is it analytic, as someone like Russell would? No, I would say I don't think that question can be reduced to some social content in a sense of capitalism or socialism. Now, I am aware that the fact that questions like that and the answers provided to them only occurred in a certain form in bourgeois society, right? I accept that, and there's a complicated dynamic there, back and forth. But I'm frustrated by the assumption that really the problem of philosophy seems to me one of a highly abstract social thing. There's something, and maybe this is my limitation, but
it's highly mediated. Right? So mediated, highly mediated.
I mean, the other thing that I would say, just and then I'll sort of shut up for a while and talking about, is one of the things that I'm aware of with Chris, and it's a very subtle distinction, is that and I tried to formulate it as an awkward formulation. I said sometimes, Chris, you seem to have a sociological imagination and I have a historical. And what is the stakes implicit in that? Well, I would say one thing is sociology is an entirely modern phenomenon. It's meaningless. It would be absurd to talk about a medieval sociologist. Medieval people wouldn't understand the concept of sociology. It's not absurd to talk about medieval or ancient historians. So the concept of history allows also a concept of the transhistorical. Much more than Chris, I'm willing to embrace the idea that certain aspects of philosophy are transhistorical, which curiously, even though we're otherwise opposite, brings me at certain points closer perhaps to Jensen. For example, like on the question of the logic as involving some kind of transhistorical understanding, I think that Jensen's reading of that as Hegel's intention, leaving aside the truth content, is correct.
So, Teo's question, is the apotheosis of the state as freedom as accounted for by Hegel, and how we access it retrospectively as reactionary bourgeois conformism, irrelevant to his whole philosophy?
I think it's unfair to me.
Yeah, it's a little unfair. Jensen, do you have anything to say on the state?
Well, I guess I sort of have the same view on that. I mean, the criticism of Korsch on the philosophy question would probably be similar on the question of state. Insofar as, so a little digression first. So part of the Hegelian thought in the philosophy of right is that he's going to give an account of what right actually is. So abstract right can't count as right. Morality can't count as right. These are inadequate paradigms for giving an account of what right is. The only account of right that's an adequate account of right has to be, abstract right, morality, and ethical life as a threefold dynamic. Similarly, he wants to give an account of ethical life itself in terms of the threefold dynamic of family, civil society, and state. Hegel's justification, he wants to say that on its own, civil society is inadequate for giving an account of what ethical life is. The system of need that civil society embodies, that in itself, that can't account for why we take ourselves to be participating in civil society, what we take ourselves to be doing. There has to be some collective project that, police officers, businessmen, take themselves to be participating in. There has to be some way that they can understand what they're doing as, not just compatible with what one another is doing, but in some way, mutually necessary, integral, etc. So Hegel looks to the state and says that, the state is the form of, this collective self-justification. It's the account that we give to ourselves as to why we're doing what we're doing, and without this sort of, this collective dimension to the project, we wouldn't be able to understand society as society, basically. Now, what everyone wants to say about Hegel's account of the state or universality, that is his theory of institutionality, of what institutional life is. And I think that that's an irreducible element of giving an account of what any social form, that's trying to be a social form, could be, would have to include. So we can say that when Korsch undertakes a critique of the state following Lenin and says that the state would wither away, under in the transitional phase of socialism and the dictatorship of the proletariat, I agree with that with respect to how the state has been understood hitherto, but with respect to what Hegel means by that, as the collective institutional dimension of a social project or sociality as such, I don't think that that can be dispensed with. I think that Hegel is absolutely right that that is just an essential component of giving an account of what social life is.
I have a response that could address something that Richard raised, which is the alleged sociological. Right. So, forgive me, but I would say that Hegel is simply restating Rousseau's general will.
Sure, I would disagree.
So, in this respect, the question is, what about the fact that the general will seems divided between the political realm and the civil social realm? Right. In other words, one of the problems raised by the French Revolution is how do we adjudicate the private sphere and the public sphere, etc. And so there might be a category error at work a little bit here, which is to say that Korsch and Lenin and Marx don't use the state in the same way that Hegel uses the state, right? That they, by saying that the state is the special bodies of armed men, like that definition of the state, is very narrow. It's even narrower than the law or governmentality, right? It's literally the police and the armed forces, and that's what's imagined to be withering away. So not social institutions per se, but rather the coercive function, which has proven to be necessary. And so the question is, I think that the formulation is that civil society realizes itself in the state, by which is also meant is mediated by the state, by which is also meant is contradicted by the state, right? This is where Hegel stands at a kind of a crossroads in the midst of some changes that are taking place between Rousseau and Marx. In other words, he can't take on Rousseau's general will unproblematically, nor can he reinterpret it as a coercion in the way that Marx does, and for the reasons that Marx does. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about right meeting right and force deciding. I don't think Hegel would have put it just that way. And I think the reason that Marx puts it that way is not a vulgarization or something. It's not some kind of retreat from the Hegelian project, but a recognition of its necessary impossibility under changed circumstances, namely under capitalism. And so, again, the issue is not to simply identify philosophical questions with society, but rather the speculative proposition is that there's a critical relationship between philosophical questions and society. In other words, that you can criticize society from the standpoint of philosophy, or you could criticize philosophy from the standpoint of society, and you could criticize society from the standpoint of philosophy. In other words, it's not about subordinating one to the other, but to keep the critical relationship between the two in view, because they're there. In other words, you can't understand modern philosophy as anything other than a critique of society. Even analytic philosophy, I think, should be understood as a critique of society. So the question is, what motivates that? What prompts that?
Well, I was going to say something about like Hegel and the state.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the phrases like apotheosis of the state are unfair to Hegel. And I was going to say that, that first of all, I think Hegel
It becomes purely affirmative.
Right. So I think that to understand Hegel's view of the state, you have to give some historical context of like Prussia, 1820s, Europe, early 19th century, in terms of like not narrowly taking things that Hegel said, which are basically, I would argue again, Hegel is basically speaking as a liberal.
Yeah. He would say civil society is free enough under Prussian absolutism in the early 19th century.
But I think there's a tendency to read, particularly in the 20th century, tendency to read Hegel's early 19th century political views of the state from a 20th century experience. That being said, I think there's a fundamental difference in the view of Marx and Lenin on the state at a theoretical level from Hegel, and I don't think that they can be assimilated to each other. They're just,
yeah, when Lenin defines the state in terms of the preservation of social antagonism, I mean, that is fundamentally antithetical to how people.
It is, and that's because they have antithetical politics, and they're living in very different times.
Yeah.
But they also had antithetical politics. I mean, and Lenin would have.
Well, wait. If you say that socialism is antithetical to liberalism, that's a highly vexed way of putting it, right? Because then liberalism becomes a lie.
No. It becomes. I mean, again, like the problem of socialism and liberalism become very contorted in our time. But in the 19th century, the vision that socialists had was that socialism would fulfill the unfulfilled promise of liberalism.
Right. So liberalism is necessary but insufficient, which actually gets to Jensen's formulation about the philosophical problem being necessary but insufficient.
But it's also like the approach, both political and philosophical, to the theory of the state is different. I mean, I don't know, maybe.
I would say liberalism can't really account for the necessity of the coercive character of the state. That it's a necessary evil that's left unexplained. In other words, I was just teaching my students this week in my Marx and Marxism class, that the existence of the police in prisons is in itself a scandal for bourgeois society. In other words, it can only be explained by some irreducible, unsocial character of individuals. What can you do with these people? You just have to lock them up. In other words, it casts them outside of bourgeois society. It becomes extrinsic. Whereas you could say, well, no, it's intrinsic. It's a white supremacist state. It's patriarchal. It's the feminization of the working class, the queering of black people, and they're put in jail, right? It's some kind of like inevitable, irreducible, result of trying to impose liberal norms on everybody.
One thing, again, historically, the bourgeoisie, in its earlier revolutionary phase, encouraged the strengthening of the state, right? You
mean the absolutist state?
But the bourgeois revolution and the rise of the bourgeoisie have contradictory effects in terms of the state. On the one hand, a large part of the rise of the bourgeoisie is the creation of a modern state, and it's also the struggle against its arbitrary authority. I mean, both of those are products of the rise of the bourgeoisie historically. And that relationship to the state seems paradoxical in modern times because of certain extremely negative experiences.
But again, Marxism has an explanation.
Yes, Marxism has a very good
explanation for why there's the police and why there's prisons.
Right.
Which is that humanity has been rendered superfluous to value creation. And so you have a lumpen proletariat, you have a Lazarus layer of the living dead in society who are cast out of the social relations of labor. And so, of course, then they are seen as extrinsic and irreducible, unsocial, unassimilable element, and you just do away with them. And so, there is, in that sense, an explanation for why the state, as in other words, Hegel's notion of the state is not as a coercive force, but rather as an objectification, right? A kind of externalization, realization of something that it should not be.
No, I think this is actually a point on which there's a kind of general agreement.
There is, but I think that it gets us to, why would this come back? In other words, if it's a sort of a settled philosophical question, in a sense.
No, I don't think it's a philosophical question at all. I think it's just a purely historical.
How so?
I think that it has to do with like Hegel's different conception of politics, the radically different nature of European society.
Was he too optimistic?
I mean, in a way he was too optimistic, but I think that the types of it's like asking, was liberalism too optimistic? Well, maybe it was too optimistic. It didn't, you could say that equally Marxism was the one that was too optimistic because it imagined that these contradictions would be overcome by socialist revolution. So in that sense, viewed from the standpoint of the present, Lenin seems the absurdly optimistic one, whereas Hegel seems the realistic one, right? But if you're asking, what is the origin of the difference, I don't think the origin of the difference can be understood in philosophical terms. I think it has to be understood in terms of a different reading of history and society and the role of class conflict and the idea of socialism and things like that.
Well, one point on that score is that at least from Hegel's standpoint, Hegel took his philosophy of right, to be based on his logic. That the logic was part of what provided the justificatory resources for doing a philosophy of right. And so the state, in modern bourgeois society, it's not just that he's giving an account of the present or an actuality, but he's also saying that this is the realization of reason.
I agree completely with your reading of Hegel. The question is, do we need to read Hegel that way?
Robert Pippin once said in a provocative way to a class, he said, to take Hegel seriously, one would have to recognize even the Democratic People's Republic of Korea as an expression of spirit. Right? And so what I heard in that was like a little ghost of some new left anti-imperialism, right? Right? So and I don't think that means that he thinks that the world should become Stalinist, right? But rather that one can't simply reject it as an error. Now, I don't know whether there was also some strange Hegelian nationalism built into that or something, meaning that maybe North Korea needs to be as it is and America needs to be as it is, right? Who knows, right? There might have been some of that. In other words, some anti-Trotskyism, some Stalinism. But still, right? And he said it to, his usual cohort of students who are a mixture of philosophy students and committee on social thought students, meaning all irredeemable reactionaries, right? And so, how about some North Korea for you? As some geistic reality. No, in all seriousness, right? I think that it cuts to the issue of whether philosophy is meant to be affirmative or critical. And so I do think that I'd be neglecting something if I said that there are two beginnings to Adorno's negative dialectics. One is philosophy lives on because its moment for being realized was missed. The other, however, is the preface to negative dialectics, in which he says the phrase negative dialectics flouts tradition. And what he means by that is that it's nonsensical from a philosophical standpoint. That it's either meaningless or redundant. Right? Because the dialectic is either negative, or it's not a dialectic, or to make the dialectic negative is actually to not be dialectical. Right? So then why? Right? Because of course what Adorno meant to grasp by that phrase negative dialectics is that one has to be Hegelian but critical and not affirmative. But Hegel himself would have thought of himself as critical and not affirmative. And that being Hegelian is somehow destructive and negative. In other words, there's negative in the critical sense, but there's negative in the sense of Hegel being identified with the destructiveness of capitalist society, which consumes its own past, as we know. In other words, the famous rejection by everyone of dialectic of enlightenment, that enlightenment leads to the gas chamber, is that this is some kind of flattening of history. No, the Enlightenment really does lead to the gas chambers, meaning capitalism really was always what it is. Right? And so the bourgeois dialectic was always this destructive thing that Max Weber and others thought that it was. Right? So again, do we need philosophy for a description of reality, for an analysis of reality? Do we need it to affirm our social reality, or do we need it in another sense? Right? The fact that we're faced with that choice, right? Descriptive account,
I mean, when
negative
you say,
critique.
do we need? Who needs? I mean, that's,
We, everybody.
But did
You know, working class kid from Valley Stream.
But
Why do I need philosophy?
Well, Hegel at least thought that those options weren't mutually exclusive.
Right.
That there is a distinction that he would draw between philosophy and what now we would call critical theory, or his, real philosophy. That both the critical and the descriptive enterprise are possible, and that's the distinction that he draws between, say, a logic and a philosophy of right. And I mean, I assume that you would be amenable to that sort of distinction.
I would. I mean, and the question you raised about logic and philosophy of right, I mean, the question that I would raise, which is about really an interpretive question for reading Hegel, is does one need to read this as a logical necessity? In other words, it seems to me that
a logical necessity versus a historical necessity.
Right, exactly. It seems to me that a large part of Hegel can be read in a way that Hegel would have rejected the reading himself, and that essentially that's what Marx does, as well as many other people. In fact, most other people, I would say, I mean, my sense of Pippin, I don't comment, is actually that Pippin does that. That Hegel would not recognize Pippin's reading of him as his own reading.
You mean that it becomes historically contingent?
That it becomes historically contingent. Hegel is a very funny and figure, and I mean, I have more difficulty certainly with
I think
Hegel.
he stands in for the bourgeois revolution itself. So I'm reminded suddenly of David Harvey, right, who claims that reading Marx's Capital, you have two different things going on. You have a logical exposition and you have a historical exposition, right? In a way that Marx himself would not have distinguished between those two. Right? In other words, Marx would not have said that the emergence of bourgeois society was either logically determined nor a contingent accident. Right? So that cuts to the issue, really, of why we still need Hegel, because, of course, Hegel's also dealing with that problem.
But I think there's a difference between Marx's analysis and Hegel's, because like the structure of Capital, like what David Harvey says, I understand that.
But that's a symptom. The
Well,
fact that Marx disintegrates into the logical and historical is itself
it's a symptom, but there it's about sort of two different perspectives. The problem with Hegel is that and it's really what Jensen said, it's about how the logical and the historical, right? The necessity.
The logical necessity is historical necessity.
The logical necessity is historical necessity, right? And that's a different type of problem. It's actually a philosophical problem that actually it influences Marx, but Marx is not operating with the same problem. And I think that Marx often, and I think the whole history of philosophy, often reads Hegel emphasizing the historical insight. And I'm amenable to that, right? That's the only way, most of the time, that I can read Hegel and make sense of Hegel.
But I think that there's a distinction that, again, has to be drawn here, because, for instance, Hegel would say, okay, the transition from the, Greek polis to Roman conception of legal personhood, that's historical necessity, because the way that the Romans were justifying to themselves what they were doing, that logic of justification can be understood as a response to what the Greeks were doing. So we can see that not as necessary in the sense that it had to happen, but that there is a developmental logic to that sort of justification. On the other hand, the transition from a logic of being to a logic of essence, that's a logical necessity, not a historical necessity for Hegel.
Hegel would say that the inadequacies of the concept of measure, that why that necessitates a logic of essence, that's purely logical.
Right, I agree with your reading of Hegel. I'm not disagreeing with you at all on that point. What I'm only saying is that still raises the question about other readings of Hegel that would reject Hegel's own self-understanding, and to what extent they could be valid. Right? I think that most people, I think that Marx read Hegel in ways that Hegel would reject.
Yes.
And so what I'm willing to defend is Marx's reading of Hegel in a non-Hegelian way, or a way that he thinks is more Hegelian than Hegel himself. Right? I'm saying I prefer Marx's reading, or it makes more sense.
Of which aspect?
I prefer the emphasis on the historical to the logical aspect. Now, I
material over the ideal.
Right, which he translates into the materialism per se. Now, the thing is that I understand the point you're making about the importance of the logic in terms of Hegel's system. And one of the curious things about Hegel as a thinker is that on the one hand, he's this kind of arch-rationalist, but he's also a thinker that is remarkably, not empiricist, but empirical for a rationalist thinker. And that, I think, is a large part of the fascination of Hegel, and is actually why Hegel can form a kind of support for Marxism, intellectually. And I'm not saying...
It gets back to the method and system.
It gets back to the question of method and system, right? And I don't think that it's as simple as saying, well, Marx took Hegel's method and dispensed with the system.
We just need to know what that means. In other words,
we need to know what that means. I'm not sure that Marx knew what it meant. I'm not sure that anybody has ever really known what it meant. And it may mean, in fact, not exactly Hegel's method, as though you could subtract the method, but a method that is essentially analogous. I don't know. I'm not sure. Like, a lot of this is vague to me. But I think that the question we have here in our discussion, it keeps coming around to the idea that you start from Hegel, and then you read Marx and compare Marx to Hegel. And Marx feels unsatisfactory to you at some kind of philosophical level in terms of a self-explanation. And Chris and I start with Marx, despite our other disagreements, and we read Hegel basically through Marx. And the fact that Marx may not be fully consistent as philosophy, or that maybe the essence of what Marx is doing isn't philosophy at all, doesn't really bother us. It seems to me that more or less that's the crux of the argument. There's a separate argument between me and Chris.
I was just thinking that reading Hegel from the standpoint of Marx, you could have two different experiences. You could say that there are aporia in Hegel, or you could say Hegel's remarkably consistent in the way that Marx doesn't try to be, right? And then you could just sort of junk the whole category of consistency, and you could say, Marx is not trying to be systematic in the way that Hegel did because he recognized the fallacy of any idealist system or something like that. I think it's important to keep the critical angle in both directions. In other words, I think that Marx's critique of Hegel is valid, but I also think that something remains of Hegel that casts Marx in a critical light, or at least tasks Marx, right? And that's like Lukacs' point, right? In other words, to understand Marx's motivation, right, to free Marx from a kind of dogmatism, you need to sort of review the spirit of Hegel.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's what that point I agree with, which is why I am sympathetic to the Lukacs and the Korsch, despite my greater distance from Hegel.
Then the real issue is, how do we understand that critical relation, right? So that's I think, again.
But it's also a relationship that has changed historically. And
yes.
I don't think you can just say
there are changing fortunes.
Say that the points that Lukacs and Korsch made, that you can somehow read them almost 100 years later, and feel that
we occupy the same moment.
we occupy the same moment,
Yeah.
and that the Hegelian aspects of Marxism pass us in the same way. I don't think that that's the case. But I understand the point you made, and I understand that that's the motivation for having Lukacs and Korsch in the syllabus.
You guys seem to be addressing something that Reid already brought up, but maybe this will help. Richard said that he disagrees with Jensen about philosophy. Jensen says that Marxism as politics needs philosophy, specifically Hegelian philosophy. Richard says it does not. Chris doesn't seem to be taking either side, but recognizing both positions as symptomatic of the self-contradiction of philosophy, itself expressing the self-contradiction of bourgeois society and capitalism. In that sense, the question of Marxism and philosophy is a symptom of the self-contradiction of Marxism. So it's not either Jensen or Richard that are wrong, but they both express the problem of Marxism and philosophy one-sidedly. Chris doesn't seem to be taking a position either way, but insisting on Marxism as the self-consciousness of the contradiction. Do each of you take this as an accurate characterization of your positions?
A little too neat, but anyway.
Well, I think that actually, that if there's a disagreement about philosophy, my disagreement is probably more with, that was my original formulation. Chris and I disagree more about philosophy, and Chris and Jensen disagree more about Marxism. But I think, again, the question about one-sidedness raises the question of, like, well, but is either side correct?
Raises the question of fullness.
Right, but is it?
No, really.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the problem is there's a problem with saying something like the self-contradiction of philosophy or the self-contradiction of Marxism, because it implies that there's, particularly in the Hegelian context, that there's about to be some kind of synthesis. Right, the real problem we face is that the problem of failure, right? The problem of
incoherence,
of philosophy disintegrating, of Marxism being lost. And I think that would be optimistic to talk about, well, maybe there's some kind of dialectical contradiction or whatever. I think it's really the sympathy of the conversation is around two sets of disintegration and incoherence. And that, to me, is what's particularly different from Hegel's time, but even Lukacs and Korsch's time. It's certainly not true of Hegel, right? What Hegel is responding to is not some kind of incoherence, and that's why he feels that he can sum up the totality of history and the philosophical
But to people in his own time, I hope you recognize that to most people in his own time, reality seemed quite incoherent.
It was recently raised on the list, I can't remember by whom, but there's a famous remark in Hegel's first published text on Schelling, where he says that, the need for philosophy, in any historical moment, is brought about by the existence of antinomies to reality. And so it is,
well, Hegel transforms Kant's dialectic, right?
There is an
another
antinomy
point
of nature and spirit that gives rise to the need for philosophy. For him at the time, it was the need for the Schellingian system. So for him, it was already a matter of incoherence.
Yeah, what I would say is that, Platypus, so Marxism and philosophy and you, right? Why do we read this stuff? To keep the question open. To keep the question open. In other words, I'm obviously I'm not at all confident that I can judge the inadequacies of Marx, Lukacs, or Korsch in the way that Jensen offers the possibility of adjudicating their deficiencies. They don't provide answers. Marxism doesn't provide answers, but it does pose questions. And if you think about the kinds of questions that Marxism itself tried to address, not even answer, but just address, right? Just place, then it's fruitful to return to the sources of those very questions that Marxism took up. Right? Marxism didn't resolve the crisis of Hegelianism. You could say it didn't try to. But it registered it. It addressed it, which is different from trying to resolve it.
Well, I think it also took it for granted.
Sure. Yeah, but that's the optimism too.
That's the optimism.
Yeah.
We've got 2 more questions, and we're 3. Did you add someone?
Did someone raise their hand?
And we're short on time. I don't know if you guys want to finish with these. One's from Spencer. I think you sort of addressed some of this in response to Dane's question. Why did the young Hegelians / the crisis of Hegelian philosophy emerge? Is it just because Hegel biologically died? Could Hegel have simply carried on had he lived and remained lucid for another quarter of a century? Why specifically was there a fruitfully intense period of philosophical debate from 1835 to 1845? What necessitated the young Hegelians, and why did their moment so quickly come to an end, even though many of them biologically lived on for decades? Alternatively, why were the orthodox Hegelians after Hegel's death right-wing in a way that Hegel arguably was not? And then the second question is from Alex. If we are under regression of Marxism and philosophy, what does it mean that about the task of philosophy today? Is philosophy finished, or does regression mean it gives philosophy new tasks, or is philosophy just there to help us understand past philosophy?
Well, in answer to Spencer's question, again, I think that I certainly do not think that if Hegel had lived another quarter of a century, that would have eliminated the crisis in the system. In other words, that it is a historical problem, not a biological problem. I don't think that it's that if Hegel had died in the 1860s, that Hegelianism would have remained intact.
Well, what necessitated the young Hegelians then?
Social transformations in European society. I mean, you couldn't maintain the synthesis that the kind of balanced point that Hegel had achieved in the 1820s, that it wouldn't continue, it wouldn't be convincing. It's like, you have something that's like really, really finely balanced. And it's at some point it's just gonna tip over because there's some like movement, right? I don't think that there was anyone who could have for a long time after Hegel continued the same synthesis that both socially, externally, and internally in terms of the system, that people would have taken different parts of it and would have flown apart. I mean, that's my reading.
Well, and Hegel himself, I mean, when he says in the preface to the Philosophy of Right, the famous line that the album nerve always has flight of dust, I mean, that implies, Pippin points this out somewhere, that, if Hegel really believes that, then his own account of,
It's late.
is late.
But I think Hegel thought that he was at the end of something. So I think
The end of the process, yeah.
he thought that he had summed it up, and maybe that would be the end of philosophy. Really, the end of philosophy turned out to be more complicated because after he died, Hegelianism fractured, and there were many different reactions to it.
I mean, you could make the claim, this is Korsch's claim, that philosophy is completed with Hegel because Hegel's living through the completion of the revolt of the third estate.
Right, and I think that leaving aside the second part of that, the revolt of the third estate, I think that is the way Hegel saw himself,
right,
as a philosopher.
Right.
But I think that clearly, in terms of if you see anything that's happened in the last couple of hundred years as part of the history of philosophy, that's not an adequate answer for us to give.
Well, you could say that everything that came after Hegel tries to deny that something had been completed.
I don't think so. I mean, I think they're different responses.
I mean, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, they both dispute the characterization of the historical moment.
Or they dispute the
And Marx, in another way, disputes the.
But I think what they actually dispute is not the historical moment. but the relationship of philosophy and history.
Well, right, the
Which is a different problem.
characterization of the historical moment.
In
They
other
might
words-
all have the same historical moment in view, but they characterize it differently.
They characterize it differently, but they also, what they dispute with Hegel is the relationship of philosophy and history.
I think they dispute the bourgeois character. In other words, that what Hegel saw as a completion, Marx sees as a completion in a different sense. In other words, not an achievement, but a kind of crisis point. In other words, you see that it goes to the question of capitalism. Is capitalism the perfection of bourgeois social relations, or the negation of them? Right? The idea that it would be both, right? Because that's why you get people saying Marx is a liberal, and he's just the incomplete project of liberalism, which a lot of readings of Marx do that. It's like De Coward, it's a bunch of people. Or you could say that he's the negation of liberalism, rejection of liberalism. That he's exposing its material, rotten foundations. Bourgeois society came into existence covered in filth and blood. Right?
Yeah, but
There
for
are enough lines
Marx,
for
those
Marx.
two different aspects would not have been the problem.
Yeah.
And the fact that those are the problem is a retrospective problem of the early 21st century. It has very little to do, I think, with...
I think it already appeared in the era of Marxism itself. I think that already at the end of the 19th century, that problem was already manifest. I don't think it had to wait this long. I don't think it had to wait until postmodernism, essentially, Heidegger. I don't think it had to wait that long. I think it's already apparent. I mean, that's why Nietzsche is there. And like I said, Kierkegaard earlier. And so, yeah, I wouldn't, again, it's sort of, if there's an insoluble problem, we have to attend to its insolubility. Rather than just say, well, one shouldn't try to encompass philosophy in this comprehensive way. Or reject entirely a relationship between philosophy and politics.
When I speak about the question of the relationship between philosophy and politics, I'm not rejecting it at a theoretical level, but what I'm saying is that the examples usually given about why philosophy is necessary for doing politics by Marxists or supposed Marxists are usually bogus. And
oh yes,
and
yes. In other words, that somehow philosophical correctness will save you from political error.
right, and that a narrow linkage of philosophy and politics has been bad. It's had bad effects. So that's my main argument about philosophy and politics. I also think that if there ever is a socialist revolution, the vast majority of the people who participate in the socialist revolution will probably do so, certainly without any clear philosophical
Yes.
conception,
Yes.
and probably with only a vague conception of what socialism is.
Yes.
Right?
That's true. All right, so perhaps on that note,
Okay.